Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
The beginnings of a future pirate king. What if Luffy was never entrusted to Garp, but instead raised by Whitebeard? Follow a different journey where Luffy grows up surrounded by one of the most legendary pirate crews in the world. Chaos, laughter, brotherhood, and belonging await, all while Luffy still dreams of becoming the king of the pirates. Big shout out to the warlords of this channel: Rodarius Jones, Native Warrior, Claude Lifrace, Neo Wesker 23, Derek Doughty, Zazu Saez, Abdul Raf Ali, N3WT, What If Lord, Black Money Young Leon, Garrick Russell, Case Clark, KSGPL4YZ, and Brian McKenzie. You know who you are. Want to stand among legends? Join the channel membership and show your support. Adios.
Are we sure about this, Yoi? Commander Marco asked once more just to make sure. Yeah, Pops, this whole situation is weirding me out. I mean, why would the leader of the revolutionaries want to meet with us? Commander Thatch said, agreeing with his best friend. Why don't we all just wait and see? I mean, Garp's a nut job. Who's to say his son is any better? Commander Haruta said, giving Thatch an annoyed look in response. Gurararara. Whitebeard's laughter boomed, indicating that he was listening to his children, but agreed with Haruta. Just wait and see. There, in the distance, Thatch said, leaning over the railing to see better. Pops, I think that's him. A small boat was sailing slowly towards the grand ship. On that small boat was a figure draped in a green cloak that covered most of his body and shadowed his face. Greetings, new gate. Permission to come aboard? Monkey D. Dragon asked, looking past the many crewmates and directly towards the captain. Permission granted, though why would Garp's rebel brat want to meet with me? Whitebeard asked, eyeing the man, his interest growing. Dragon just looked the man in the eyes before he pulled his arm out of his cloak, showing the surrounding pirates a small bundle. This here is my son, he said, making every eye widen and a few mouths comically drop. What are you here for, brat? Whitebeard said once he himself recovered from the initial shock. I want you to raise Luffy, my son. His mother is a dangerous person and my reputation will make his existence a sin against the world. We want him to grow and be free. Everyone deserves to be free. Who is his mother exactly? Marco asked, now looking at the sleeping baby in Dragon's arms. No one you need to concern yourself with, he stated, as if it was the most unimportant thing in the world at this moment, in which case it probably was. I see. Why don't you get your father to raise him? He would probably love the chance to watch his grandson grow. Whitebeard stated, watching the man carefully. Where my father has a good heart and cares deeply for his family, his idols of training are mildly abusive at best. Also, the man can't keep a secret for the life of him. I'm betting Sengoku knows I'm his son, meaning they will know of Luffy soon enough. I did mention to my father of his new grandchild. He paused, looking down at the child in his arms. I want him to grow up free from the chains of this world. My father will try and push his idols upon him, and chaining him to a village will make him feel trapped. I know how you see your family. I ask that you let him into it. Dragon felt his son waking, so instead of looking at the older man, he put his attention towards the boy. Luffy just opened his eyes and smiled before grabbing his father's finger to gum. Yes, I know you're hungry. Dragon chuckled softly, pulling a rather large bottle from his cloak. If you do choose to take him, his appetite rivals my father's and one day probably yours. Dragon said, smiling now. Everyone could tell he loved his son. His entire way of holding himself screamed, proud father. What shall we tell him of you? He may wish to know who his father actually is one day, and I won't hide the fact you're not among the crew. Whitebeard asked as Marco went and took the baby from Dragon's arms. Tell him the truth if he asks. Tell him I want him to be free, find what he believes in and chase it. Either way we'll meet again on the sea. You're a happy baby, aren't you, Yoi? Marco said, smiling at the child in his arms. Luffy just smiled wider and babbled happily. A little too happy for just a little guy, don't ya think? Thatch muttered, but couldn't help but feel charmed by the baby's presence. Luffy, with his dark eyes and hair, had captured everyone's heart with just one look. Dragon studied the group with his son before giving the baby a kiss on his nose. "Be safe, be free," he whispered. Luffy just laughed. "His full name is?" Whitebeard asked Dragon, knowing full well he would be dealing with a D. "Monkey D. Luffy. He will need a lot of food. I'm hoping you can ask for some from your territories, but my group here." He trailed off, now motioning his hand towards a smaller ship that had come during the time Dragon was there. "Has a few starter items to help you along for the time being. Thank you for this, Whitebeard," Dragon said, turning his back towards the older man before hopping back on his ship and sailing off with the others. "Monkey D. Luffy. Gurarara. Welcome home, my son," he said to the small child who was gripping Marco's finger and falling asleep. Marco smiled at the child, knowing full well life on the Moby was about to change forever. When Marco said life was about to get interesting, he didn't know just how right he was. Luffy was a happy baby who only cried when he had absolutely no other choice, meaning for things such as diaper duty, and if you caught those things in time, his crying could be cut down drastically. Pops had appointed Marco his caretaker, seeing how he was the first to take the child from Dragon. Marco wanted to protest that he was too busy being the first division commander, but every other commander had either disappeared or pretended they couldn't help. Thatch, being his best friend and fellow commander, knew that if Marco was stuck on Luffy duty, then he might as well be as well. "Does he ever stop eating?" Thatch whined. The baby was just finishing off his second bottle that morning. "Well, he is a D, he's going to eat a lot regardless, Yui," Marco muttered, wondering just where that food was going. "Still, it's as if he's always hungry." Thatch pouted but smiled at the brat who had just put himself into a milk coma. "Looks like we might be set for at least 3 hours. Vista said from the wall he was leaning on. "Yeah, only for him to wake up and want more food, Yui," Marco chuckled, looking at the now sleeping baby fondly. It had been months since Dragon had come and dropped the baby off, and the mood on the crew had changed. Everyone couldn't help but feel charmed by the new brat on board. Luffy smiled often and laughed just as much. He babbled to everyone as if they could understand him. This day was different though. "He's not smiling," Thatch had whispered. It was a rare sight to see. Luffy without his smile just didn't happen. "Have you tried feeding him?" Haruta asked, now looking down at the grumpy child. "Yeah, but he refuses to take it, Yui." Marco was worried, but his lazy expression remained the same. "What about his diaper? Maybe he's, she suggested, but Marco just shook his head. "He was fine an hour ago. He even played on the deck for a while, but now I don't know," Thatch said, shrugging his shoulders. "Do you guys think he might have lost a toy? I mean, for a baby he's pretty protective of his things," Aizu had said, showing up to see what was going on. "I didn't think about that, Yui." Passing the now squirming 6-month-old Luffy to Thatch, he made his way over towards Pop's chair, looking around. "What's happening, Marco?" the old man asked his son. "Luffy's grumpy. Aizu said he might have lost a toy, so I'm looking around for what could be lost." He checked the area where Luffy had been sitting up playing with his blocks. He counted each one of them but realized Luffy's stuffed reindeer was gone. When Marco jumped up from the blocks with a look of panic on his face, the old man couldn't help but laugh. His eldest son, who had fought many battles never showing a hint of fear, was afraid that his brother had lost his special toy. "It's gone. No wonder he's grumpy, Yui. I'll have to talk to Aizu." He nodded towards Pops, who just smiled at his brat, watching his run towards the gathering group. "Well, are they all there?" Vista asked, trying to calm a now tearful Luffy who looked one moment away from a tantrum. "No, his reindeer is gone. Aizu, could you work something up? Anything at all and I'll owe you, Yui." Marco was now snatching Luffy from Vista, who appeared to be making things worse. The cross-dresser just laughed before heading to his room to work on what he could for the brat. "Luffy, Rain-chan has gone on vacation," Thatch said to the little guy, who now looked him straight in the eyes. "Rain-chan won't be back for a while, so he is going to send his nakama to keep you company." Luffy's eyes widened, but the frown remained. "He'll be here soon, so be patient, okay?" Luffy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't burst. Not yet, at least. "I think we have until dinner time before he loses it, Yui," Marco said with worry. "Why don't we try to distract him until then?" Vista said, looking down at the little guy. Marco carried him back over to Pop's chair to play with his block again, but Luffy was not interested at all. He grabbed them, looked at them, and threw them away with a glare. "Okay, lesson learned. When Luffy gets grumpy, keep flying objects away from his angry hands." Thatch had caught a block to the knee and didn't look ready to take another. "Let me see him." Pops had said from his chair, making his sons look towards him. "You sure, Pops? He's not in the best of moods?" Thatch had said in warning. "Gurararara, let me see what I can do." Marco scooped up the baby and put him on the older man's lap. Whitebeard held Luffy up with a large hand so he could sit properly on his lap but still have his back and neck supported. "Would you like to hear a story, my son?" Luffy just looked at the older man, his face blank of all emotions. Whitebeard took this as his cue to get into a story for him. Luffy had paid as much attention as a baby could, giving Marco and Thatch some time to think. The time limit they had given before Luffy burst was exactly on point. Once dinner was called, Luffy snapped. He cried and cried, no one could stop him, not even his beloved bottle. He missed his first hour of feeding. He's off schedule. That and him being cranky already. We're about to have a little monster on our hands. Thatch said, rubbing his forehead. He was right. Luffy cried right through the first 30 minutes of dinner before Aizu came running in with a stuffed colorful bear in his hands. "Hey there, Lou," Aizu said to the little guy, who stopped crying for the moment to look at the man. "I heard Rain-chan went on vacation. He sent here Kuma-chan to keep you company until he comes back." Luffy looked at the bear in his hands before he gave a hiccup and reaching towards the toy. "See, feeling better?" He did look better. His crying had all stopped and he pulled the bear close to him to hug. The only thing out of place still was his lack of a smile. "How's Luffy doing? Is he still crying?" Aizu turned to see Teach of the 2nd Division walking towards them. "His crying has stopped, but he still seems a bit out of place." Aizu was now feeling worried himself. "He'll be okay in a bit, he just needs to get to know his new bear, right buddy?" Thatch had said, rubbing Luffy's hair. "Zihaha, sure thing. I hate seeing the kid so sad." Teach smiled before walking away. "Don't us all, Yoi?" Marco agreed, looking down at the child who was now smiling. "See, much better." Aizu smiled, grateful that his brother was going back to normal. "He'll want food now that he's happy again. I'll go get the bottle ready," Thatch said, getting up and heading towards the kitchen. "Always smile, Lou. We love it when you smile," Marco whispered into Luffy's hair while the baby cuddled his new bear. Today was an unusually typical pirating day for the Whitebeard pirates. It was just nearing dusk and a party was in full bloom. Why was there a party? Well, they're pirates, of course. What pirate doesn't party? But really there was a special reason. Today happened to be Luffy's first birthday, and because of that they just had to throw the little guy a party he would never remember. The music was loud and the laughter, if not louder. Everyone was drunk in the galley, on the deck, and pretty much all over the Grand Moby. Well, everyone except poor Marco. When they had decided May 5th was going to be Luffy's birthday, they had gathered a bucket full of everyone's names and drew the person who was not allowed to drink but to spend the night watching the one the party was aimed towards. "You must think we're all crazy, don't you, Yoi?" he said to Luffy, who was being bounced on Marco's knee. "We're having a drinking party for a child way too young to even remember this." He smiled when Luffy just mumbled a bit of nonsense. Marco looked at the rest of the crew and sighed. "Looks like no one else will remember this night either, Yoi." By this time Luffy was tired of being bounced and told Marco so by biting his hand. "You're getting some pretty sharp teeth in there, aren't ya, buddy?" Marco shook his hand, realizing that actually did hurt. "Teeth? Since when?" A very drunk Thatch came stumbling towards the pair. "About a month ago, Yoi. He's been waking up throughout the nights because it hurts so much," Marco said, but wasn't actually sure if Thatch was listening. "Why don't you try giving him an ice cube? That way he can cool them down, and if it melts, it's just water," he pointed out to his friend. Marco was actually surprised Thatch was even able to think that hard by this point. "That is actually a good idea, but not when he's sleeping. I don't care if it's frozen water. I don't want him choking, Yoi," Marco said sternly to the older man, who was now laughing. "We should probably start him on some bigger solid foods, Yoi, to get his tummy ready for growing, ain't that right, buddy?" Marco cooed to the child. "Yeah, we'll make sure his first meal is pineapple," Thatch burst out laughing to a now unamused Marco. "You know, like you." Marco was ready to punch the guy over the head but kept himself calm due to Luffy being present. "Take your drunken ass to bed, Thatch, and remind me to kill you in the morning, Yoi." Marco's eye twitched as Luffy laughed along with Thatch, probably with no clue what was going on. "Yes, mother hen. Or should I say mother, pineapple." Marco pulled Luffy into his arms and aimed a kick towards Thatch's head, missing by a hair while the man ran off to cause trouble elsewhere. Mother chicken, I'll get him back for that. Why don't we get you changed and fed before us both head off to sleep, yoy? Sound good, brat? Of course it does. You get fed. Though tomorrow we'll be adding extra things to your menu. He smiled and headed towards the kitchen to warm up the bottles for bedtime and maybe make himself a tea. Yeah, tea sounded nice. At breakfast the next morning, Luffy was happily munching on a piece of apple and a slice of tangerine. He seemed to like the tangerine more than the apple, but food was food in his big brown eyes. Pretty soon he'll have a full mouth full of teeth, so if he starts to bite you, make him stop so he doesn't continue that. Jozu said to the pirates that were at the breakfast table. Though his skin could turn to diamond and Marco could just flame up, normal people like Thatch and Haruta might not appreciate being bitten by a toddler. Even though he had said this, he knew half the crew wasn't in their minds to listen to him. Everyone was either hung over or exhausted from partying all night. Oh well, he just make Marco remind everyone a little later. Haruta sat down beside the little guy and smiled. Nay, wanna see what I've been teaching him? She smiled widely at everyone before taping Luffy on the nose to get his attention. Luffy, where are your ears? Very suddenly Luffy stopped eating and lifted his hands to his ears with a smile. How about your eyes? Luffy moved his hands down from his ears towards his eyes and forehead area, the smile still in place. How about your mouth? Like the times before, he moves his hands towards his mouth and gummed his finger where teeth hadn't come in yet. How about your nose? Everyone was watching with fascination as the little guy did the movements, except Luffy didn't know just where to grab, so he reached for his half-chewed-up tangerine instead. It's still a work in progress, but I do plan to make sure he has more brains in his head than half the crew does put together. She earned a round of laughter and grumbles from those present to hear her. Gurara, he's growing up so fast, Pops said fondly about his youngest son. Yes, soon he'll be walking. His legs are getting stronger by the day. He crawls around everywhere already and pulls himself up on the railing often enough. I give him another month or two to figure it out and we'll be chasing him in no time, yoy. Marco said with a laugh and patted the little guy's head. He crawls funny though, haven't you noticed that? Thatch pointed out where most babies crawled on their hands and knees. Luffy just seemed to drag his back leg and crawl with his other. Yeah, Dr. Myra looked into it already, said everything is fine, he's just being weird. It's something he'll grow out of, yoy. Marco said, not worried if she said it was fine. Well, hopefully he won't have to and he'll be walking soon enough. Aizu said with a grin. Marco had bought him a fine bottle of sake for the bear. Luffy couldn't function without it being close by. That toy was also the reason he was able to fall asleep so well. Though since Luffy started teething, the bear's ear had become Luffy's personal chew toy. Some days when Marco needed revenge on one of his annoying nakama, he would get the person to remove the bear from Luffy's dooley mouth to be cleaned before he woke up. The drool-covered bear was never a pleasant sight, but it satisfied Marco some to use it to his advantage. Forget walking. I can't wait until he starts to talk, Thatch said in excitement, which sparked a conversation on what Luffy's first words might be. Don't grow up too fast, kiddo, but you can't stay too young forever. Oh, the dilemma of being a brother. Thatch dramatically sighed, making everyone laugh. Their brother was growing way too quickly, but at the same time way too slowly. Though that didn't really matter at the moment, everyone was just happy to have Luffy to call their brother. Luffy was sitting on Whitebeard lap just after lunch listening to his pops telling a story from his childhood. Luffy was now 14 months old and constantly getting into trouble. Marco, needing a break, plopped the brat down on the old man's lap without saying a word, turned on his heels and walked away. Confused by the development but uncaring, he decided to entertain the boy and see what happened. As he suspected, Luffy couldn't sit still. He was squirming and grabbing at Pop's pants. He looked around often and barely paid any attention to the older man. What are you thinking about, son? He asked Luffy, who opened his mouth before closing it, looking frustrated. Pops could only raise an eyebrow at the action. Luffy began to babble sounds of annoyance before Pops knew he wanted down. And where do you think you're going, brat? He said as Luffy did his weird crawl away from his chair. Luffy paused for a moment, looked at the older man, then continued on his adventure. Luffy crawled slowly around the deck before grabbing onto a railing and pulling himself up and slowly pulling himself along that for a while. Of course he could only do that for a little bit and dropped to his crawl once more. Along his little journey he had decided that he was tired of crawling and chose to roll instead. Whitebeard was talking to one of his children and didn't see the small child slip past his feet under his chair. "Hey, has anyone seen Luffy?" Thatch asked loudly, hoping everyone could hear. "He was on my lap at least an hour ago, he couldn't have gotten far," Pop said, but he too was getting worried. The ship had been quiet, Luffy was never quiet. Thatch knew if Pops didn't know then Marco was sure to. Racing to the man's cabin he knocked on the door only to get a very annoyed tired-looking Marco. "Is the ship burning down, Yui?" Marco growled out at Thatch, who knew better than to wake Marco after an all-nighter. "No worse, Luffy's missing." With those words all sleep and crankiness was forgotten and Marco was racing towards Pop's chair. "How long has he been missing, Yui?" Everyone could hear the panic in his voice, but his lazy expression remained the same. "About 2 hours now," Teach said, looking at the first commander. Marco nodded in understanding. Everyone spread out, he couldn't have gotten far. Namur checked the tides, if perchance he did fall off you can find him faster than us, Yui. Namur nodded and dove into the water. Everyone was looking for the brat while Pops watched his children search. His nurses had made it quite clear he was not to move from that chair until his medication had settled into him. "Excuse me, Pops, he might have ended up under your chair. It might not have happened, but it is a possibility," Teach said, getting the older man's approval to look under his chair, and lo and behold was a sleeping baby. "Zee-ha-ha-ha-ha-ha, look at you wanting to be close to your old man," Teach said before reaching in and waking the child. Once he had Luffy in his arms, the baby broke into instant tears. "No need to cry, you're safe, brat," Teach said, trying to calm the kid, but that just made him cry harder. "Oi, he's been found," he yelled out for everyone to hear. Marco was the first one to hear the large man and rushed to Luffy's side instantly. Luffy, he saw the baby was crying and did an instant check over him to make sure he wasn't hurt. Seeing nothing wrong with him, Marco removed the child from Teach's arms only for Luffy to break out in a smile. "What a weird little guy, aren't you?" Teach said, patting Luffy on the head, making him once more become teary-eyed. "Huh, he seems to not like you that much," Thatch said, arriving beside Marco. "He just doesn't know me yet, Zee-ha-ha," Teach said before leaving altogether. "Where in the world were you going, Lou?" Thatch asked the now happy baby that was cuddling close to Marco. "Ma," came from Luffy's mouth, making everyone stop. "What was that, Yoi?" Marco asked the toddler. "Ma, ma 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 ma," he just said, looking at Marco. Everyone didn't know if they should break out laughing or celebrate their brat's first word. "Look, Marco shall now be known as Mama Marco." Thatch laughed so hard he doubled over. Ignoring Thatch, Marco smiled fondly at the little guy. "Were you looking for me, Luffy, Yoi?" he said. Luffy just responded with "Ma." "Well, you have had him in your care the most, Marco. I'm not surprised he sees you like that," Pops said with a smile. Luffy looked right at the old man, smiled and said, "Pa." The crew broke out in cheers. Their little guy was learning to talk. Just watch his next few words be a vocabulary of curses, a crew member joked, making everyone laugh. "Not if I have anything to say about it, Yoi," Marco said with a smile. "Nah, it won't be like that at all. His next word will be, Yoi." Thatch was laughing again, but this time Marco didn't care Luffy was calling for him. Ever since the baby had been dropped off, not once had he been out of Marco's sight. Marco pulling an all-nighter to finish reports and file doents and write food lists made him extra tired, and not needing a toddler to deal with. It seemed though that Luffy couldn't be without his ma. "You know what this calls for? A party," everyone cheered in excitement. "You going to join us this time, Marco?" Vista asked him with a smile. "I don't mind watching the brat this time. You missed out on his birthday." Marco only shook his head. "Nah, I like spending time with this brat, and honestly watching you all get drunk is funnier than actually joining in, Yui." Luffy was closing his eyes slowly after just letting out a yawn. "And it seems the both of us are due for nap anyways." Waving to everyone, Marco headed back towards his room and placed Luffy in his crib. "Night, Lou, please let me have 3 more hours and all will be good." The baby just mumbled "ma" and fell asleep. Marco crawled into his own bed, ready to gain the hours missed so he could make fun of his family later. "Where's he going with that?" Thatch asked, watching Luffy walk on his little legs holding a few pieces of breakfast in his hands. "Dunno, Luffy, what cha got there, little guy?" Haruta asked Luffy, bending down to his level. "Bridge Foz," he said to her proudly with a smile. "Breakfast for who, buddy?" Thatch asked him. "Bridge Foz for Mako," he said in his adorable words that made them laugh. "Why don't we bring him a plate of food instead, buddy?" Thatch chuckled but Luffy scowled. "No, IBR Faz for Mako." He turned on his heels and went straight to the said man's room. "Mako, Mako," Luffy called to the man, hoping he would open the door. He didn't wait long. "What is it, brat Yui?" He covered his eyes from the sun, he was so tired. "I bro Br Faz." He reached his hands out, showing the pile of eggs in his little hands. Marco looked down at it in worry but knew he was stuck with it. No one says no to Luffy, it's impossible. Especially when he gives you those big brown eyes that water the moment you consider the word no. "Thanks Luffy, it looks delicious Yui." Luffy smiled as Marco took the eggs from his hands. "I'll put it here for now and eat it in a bit, okay?" Luffy smiled as wide as possible to Marco. Ever since Luffy had learned to walk fully and start using more of his words, he began to bring things to people. Most of the time it was a toy, book or just something that belonged to another person. Mostly Marco, Thatch and Pops got the gifts and waited for the person to come and get their belongings. On other occasions people were given food from his little hands. Once one of the crew members tried to deny the food and Luffy broke into devastated tears until the member took and ate it right there and then. Sadly it was Stefan's dog Kibbles, but it made the kid smile. 6 months had passed and Luffy was now a loud 2-year-old. Marco. Luffy came running towards him at full speed before crashing into his leg, giving a hug. "I wasn't gone that long Luffy Yui." He chuckled and patted the little kid's head. "Did Cha bring me any food?" he asked, giving the wide puppy eyes. "No, but if you go find Thatch he might have something for you Yui," he smiled. I already tried," Luffy exclaimed dramatically. "He said to wait for dinner, so I said why?" He smiled up at Marco, who just picked the little guy up. "Did you eat all of your lunch?" Luffy nodded with his smile. "But it wasn't enough." Marco ruffled his hair with a smile. Luffy had moved on from baby foods to full-grown meals just as quickly as he had learned to run. "You're growing too quickly little brother, but you're still a shrimp to me Yui." Luffy hit his fist against Marco's chest. I'm a big boy now, I too." Marco laughed. "Oh? And 2 makes you a big boy?" Thatch asked, coming out of nowhere and tickling Luffy, who was trapped in Marco's arms. "Stop Thatchy." Luffy laughed before Marco put him down and he was off. "You were able to say not to him Yoi?" Marco asked his friend before he went to chase after the kid. "I didn't look in his eyes. The kid can't get everything he wants Marco. He needs to learn that the world will reject him even once in a while. If we spoil him rotten he'll never grow." Thatch may be the goof on the ship but he knew what was best right now. "Also, have you seen how much he eats? If I said yes I'd be cooking the rest of the afternoon." Thatch laughed before he raced after the little boy who had stopped to look back at them. "Sometimes I forget just where he is. We're lucky there haven't been any major fights either Yoi." Marco trailed off while walking towards Pop's chair. "We have been lucky. We can stay close to safe waters for now, but soon enough he'll have to be trained. There may come a time we won't be there for him. He needs to know how to protect himself," Pop said to Marco, who had jumped up to sit on the edge of the older man's chair. "Sometimes I wish he'd never grow up, but other times I can't wait to see what he'll become Yui." Marco smiled at his father. "He'll be a force to be reckoned with someday, that's for sure. A man who won't ever take no for an answer Gurarara." Marco couldn't help but laugh along with his father. "I'm glad he'll be one of us then Yui." He smiled, looking out towards the sea, listening to Luffy's laughter ring across the waves. "He's going to be big someday, he's going to be strong. Strong enough to change everything, I can just feel it Yui. I can't wait," was all the old man said, and they fell into a comfortable silence listening to the crew around them, their family, and their home. It was just before dinner when a loud crash could be heard below deck. A bunch of swearing was heard quickly afterwards and a naked 4-year-old was running past everyone to hide behind Pops. "Luffy!" Thatch had yelled, running after the fast kid. "Stop hiding behind Pops and take your bath." Thatch was soaking wet and covered in bubbles, his shirt missing, and he was only wearing a pair of shorts. "Don't wanna Thatchy!" he shouted and stuck his tongue out at the man. Luffy climbed up to Pop's lap, hoping he was safe there. Luffy had been painting 2 hours previously and made quite a mess. Messes needed to be cleaned up and Luffy needed a bath. "Luffy, you're dripping rainbows all over Pop's chair. Don't make me climb up there." Thatch was serious and Luffy knew this, so he snuggled into the older man a little closer. "Luffy, listen to your brother," the old man said, patting his head with his large hand. "Don't wanna." He looked up at Pops, giving the big eyes. Thankfully Whitebeard knew to look away. "If you don't get down here, I'll tell Marco what all that paint was for," Thatch said to the boy, who turned his head quickly, his eyes widened. You said you wouldn't, you helped?" he shouted to his brother before he wiped the yellow off his nose. "You did most of the work," Thatch argued with the kid. "But you still helped," Luffy shouted back. The argument went for a bit longer before Thatch realized he was arguing with a 4-year-old. "Screw it. You're getting your bath." Thatch had planned to climb up there, but Luffy started to climb higher. "Luffy, why don't we make a deal? You take a bath now and I'll tell you a story right afterwards," Pop said to the kid, who stopped climbing to listen to him. "Story now, bath later?" Luffy asked him, but Whitebeard shook his head. "Bath now, story after. Your brother is right, you're dripping a rainbow everywhere. Go and be fast, son," Pop said, picking the boy up and giving him to Thatch. Luffy grumbled but accepted his fate for this week. "Be fast, Thatchy. I want story now," he demanded to his brother, who rolled his eyes and thanked his pops. Once Thatch had Luffy down below deck, everyone thought they'd have quiet for a few moments at least while the brat was being bathed. How wrong they were. "Thatch Yoi," Marco yelled before stomping towards the main deck. "Where is he, Yoi?" He glared at everyone, who knew better than to fight an angry Marco. "Better question. Where's Luffy?" He looked towards Pops and saw the paint. "He was here, wasn't he, Yoi?" he stated, and waited for a crew member to answer him. "He's giving the brat a bath. He's covered in paint. I'm guessing you know why he is like that?" Vista asked from the railing he was leaning against. "Yeah, he painted my room every color he could find. I'm guessing he had Thatch's help since the paint's everywhere and Luffy only has a limited reach, Yoi," he stated unhappily before walking towards the bathroom to confront his prankster brothers. "Never for a moment can we get quiet around here," another crewmate said, but he voiced it with fondness, for no one would have it any other way. Luffy was in tears this time and Marco was trying not to laugh. "It's just a little prick and it will be all over, Yoi," Marco said while trying to hide his smile. "I don't wanna," Luffy shouted at the nurse, trying to calm him down while Marco sat in a chair beside him. "Luffy, you need to get your big boy needles so you don't get sick," the nurse said kindly to him. "I don't wanna," he repeated only louder. Just where in the world did he learn that phrase? Thatch murmured, getting tired of Luffy's new favorite words. "I wish I knew, Yoi," Marco said, rubbing his forehead but still smiling. "Luffy, how about this? Get your big boy needle and I'll give you some candy," Thatch said to the kid, making him smile, but Marco wanted nothing to do with that. "If you give him sugar, he's yours." "I can't deal with a hyper Luffy, Yoi," Marco said after learning his lesson the last time Lu had sugar. "Not going to help me, are you?" Thatch asked him with a crooked grin. "Nope, this one's all yours. I haven't forgiven you yet for my room, Yoi," he said, side glancing at the man. "Marco is a cranky bastard," Luffy cheered, then scowled as the nurse gave him the needle. "And just where did he learn that one, Yoi?" This time Marco was fully facing a now sweating Thatch. Thatch said that. "Then we painted your room," Luffy told the man while Thatch paled. "Luffy, you weren't supposed to say that," he whined to the child. "Oops." He giggled and took the sucker from the nurse before bolting out the door. Marco sighed before slapping his friend on the back of the head. "Whatever. Go get the brat. I wasn't kidding when I said he's yours to deal with, Yoi." Marco stood up and walked out of the room. The kid was bouncing off the walls after that little of sugar. Never again. Once the candy was gone, it was not coming back. Marco planned to write that down in his books to constantly remind himself. "Wait up, Marco. I was thinking it's about time we start teaching him to swim." Thatch ran to catch up with his friend. Marco raised his eyebrow further. "He's 4 now, that's a perfect age to start. I mean, he's normal like me and not a freak like you, so he should be able to learn," Thatch said offhandedly, making Marco close his eyes in annoyance. "And why am I the freak in all of this? Have you seen how normal you actually aren't, Yoi?" Marco said before walking faster away. "So you don't think it's a good idea?" he asked Marco, who just sighed. "I never said that, Yoi. I'll talk with Namor, you talk with Pops. Sound good?" Thatch smiled and ran off to find Luffy and Pops. Never a dull moment around here, is it, Yoi? He said, smiling. He'll be 5 in a few months. Kids really do grow up too fast, don't they? He couldn't help but let his smile grow. Maybe we should start teaching him to fight as well. He thought out loud, another reminder to write in his book. Oh well, it's not like he's that busy running his division or anything. With that, he headed towards his cabin to finish his work. He actually sinks like an anchor, Thatch had said from where he was standing. Maybe we're not teaching him right, Yoi, Marco said, watching the boy sink yet again. Namur's teaching him. He's a fishman. No one swims better than a fishman. Namur's teaching him right. Luffy just isn't getting it. Aizu said from beside Thatch, watching his little brother being saved by the fishman once again. It's been 2 years, he should at least know how to float, Thatch exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air for extra dramatic effect. Marco sighed before looking down at his little brother. We can deal with that later, we need to get him back on the ship, Yoi. We have visitors coming. With that, he stood up and signaled Namur that the lessons were over. Who's coming? Thatch asked seriously. A visitor could mean anything. Akagami Shanks. No clue why, he just wants to meet with Pops, Yoi, he said, but Thatch could feel the tension around him. Marco didn't like Shanks all that much. Once out of the water, Luffy was towel dried and new clothes put on him. Nay, why did we end early? I know I'm bad, but I could have gone a lot longer. He wanted to swim so badly, but his body refused to work for him. We have someone coming to visit, Brat. Be on your best behavior, Namur said before taking the towel and drying Luffy's head. Visitor? I've never had one before. Who? Luffy shouted excitedly, grabbing onto Namur's hand, making the fishman smile. Someone strong, so stay by Marco's side and listen to him. All right, he said to the brat, but knew it went right over his head. By the time Luffy was dried off, the crew was starting to gather around Pop's chair. Luffy went running straight to Marco and bombarded him with questions that the man tried to answer as best as he could. So is he as strong as Pops? Luffy said excitedly. Marco chuckled at that. Well, he has the same title as Pops, but I wouldn't ever say he's stronger. Marco smiled to the brat. Luffy had a way to taking away all the tension in the air, making the crew feel more relaxed. Soon enough, the Red Force came into view and Luffy was jumping so much Marco just decided to pick him up. Permission to come aboard? Shanks asked from his ship. Whitebeard just nodded and the red-haired man jumped across. Sorry, but this is still a rival ship. I can't let my guard down, he said before releasing a wave of haki. Quite a few of the many division members collapsed around the man as he carried a large bottle of sake towards the captain. Oi Akagami, watch your haki. You could have hurt someone, Yoi. Marco knew by speaking out he was drawing attention towards him and consequently Luffy. I can never be too careful. Nay Marco, wanna join my crew? Shanks asked with a smile, looking towards the blonde man, but his eyes widened at the child in his arms. Never, I'm good here, Yoi, he said, giving the Emperor a glare and holding Luffy tighter. Who's the brat? Shanks asked, his voice growing tighter. Luffy looked at Shanks with wide brown eyes. Somehow Luffy had managed to get past the wave of haki Shanks had released moments before, completely unfazed by it. I'm Luffy, he said, wiggling around in a way to tell Marco he wanted down, but Marco wasn't going to let him go so easily. I didn't think you'd take a child out to see Whitebeard, Shanks said sternly to the older man. He's been with us since birth, brat. We knew the risks, Whitebeard replied, looking down at Shanks. No fighting. Luffy had bitten Marco and in his surprise he dropped the kid. Don't be mean to Pops, he said, giving Shanks a glare which ended up failing miserably, making Shanks laugh at him. But that's what pirates do. We fight, Shanks said to the kid, who smiled a bit. But don't be mean. Marco doesn't like me seeing people be mean. He'll get cranky and become a bastard, he said to Shanks, who broke out laughing. No wonder you keep the kid on board. He's hilarious, he smiled down at Luffy. What's your dream, kid? He asked Luffy, who just looked at Shanks like he was an idiot. I'm gonna be a pirate, stronger than Marco, stronger than Pops, and stronger than you. He smiled at Shanks as the man's eyes widened. He subconsciously touched his straw hat, then looked towards Whitebeard only to see a wide smile on the older man's face. Luffy, why don't we let the captains talk? Thatch said, taking Lu's hand and leasing him away from Shanks. But I want to stay with my new friend, he whined to his brother. How about this? I go and make you a nice snack and we draw some pictures for the captains for later. Sound good? Thatch said, trying to get the brat to listen. He agreed, taking Thatch's hand and nodding towards Marco, who sighed and watched them disappear below deck. "Why are you here, brat?" Whitebeard asked Shanks, who sat down. "There's a bunch of new rookies heading your way. They bothered us a bit, but we sent them packing. I'm afraid they didn't seem to learn their lesson. Thought I'd warn you before they hit. Rumors have been going around that you've been sticking to safe waters. I wanted to know why, so I came to also get that question answered. Guess I got it." He smiled at the memory of that kid. "A child, Whitebeard. You know it's not safe on these seas," he said to the older man, who smiled softly. I agree, brat. I was called upon a meeting with the kid's father 6 years ago, and he sprung upon me a brat. I don't regret it. I've watched him grow. He'll make his dream a reality, and then he'll make it larger than that." He smiled off in the distance. "I like the kid. We should have a party," he shouted, making his own crew shout in agreement on his own ship. While the captains talked, Luffy had drawn pictures of his pops, Marco, Shanks, and anything else he could think of while stuffing his face with food. "Can we go back now, Thatchy? I want to see the new guy," he complained once he finished eating everything around him. "I guess it's been a bit. We should be able to go up now." "Alright, brat, let's go," Thatch said, getting a cheer from the kid. He took Luffy's hand, leading him back up to the group. Who would have thought that this emperor coming this day would spark a new dream into a young child? And the day was only beginning. "Oi, what are you doing, anchor?" Shanks said to Luffy, who had been exploring the Red Force with the captain. "I'm going to prove to you I'm as strong as any pirate," Luffy exclaimed, holding a knife in his hands. "Right, you're just a brat still. Come on down and I'll get you a glass of juice," Shanks said to Luffy, who just glared at the captain. "I'll prove it." He steadied his hands and pointed the knife towards his face. Shanks laughed and dared him to do something, hoping the kid actually wouldn't. Luffy did. He stabbed himself just below his left eye, blood coming from the wound, and Luffy screaming made everyone stand on edge, and Shanks panicked. "You dumb ass," he shouted and ran towards the kid, picking him up and throwing the knife on the ground, a chorus of shit racing through his head. Using his shirt, he tried to stop the bleeding while calling his doctor to fix the mess. Luffy ended up getting 2 stitches, but he didn't lose his eye. "It didn't hurt at all," Luffy said proudly while Marco was giving Shanks a lecture. "Right, then what were those tears for?" Shanks teased, tuning Marco out, who was completely pissed off. "How did he even get the knife in the first place, Yui?" he said to Shanks, who rolled his eyes and turned back to Marco to argue his case. During that time, Luffy began to look around. "Nay, Luffy, that was pretty crazy of you. You could have hurt yourself worse. The captain was really worried about you," Usopp said to Luffy, bringing his attention back. The kid just rolled his eyes. "Then why does he make fun of me?" he argued to the sniper. "Because he cares and he doesn't know how to deal with children. If you were my son, Usopp, I would have handled it much differently. You know, you're about the same age as my boy. I left him back with my wife in a small village in the East Blue. You and him would get along well, I can see it. He looks just like my wife, even got her nose." Usopp laughed and continued on about his son. Luffy listened for a while but got bored and decided to look around the galley. "I'm hungry," he muttered to himself. Ben had stepped in, hoping to calm the Phoenix down before he killed the captain, and Usopp had grabbed one of his nakama aside to continue his talk about Usopp. "Nay, what's this?" Luffy said, opening a small trunk that had been set aside in the galley of the Red Force. Seeing it was a medium-sized fruit and his stomach was growling, he shrugged his shoulders and took a bite. If his stomach wasn't growling so loudly, he would have spat the fruit out, but food was food and never to be wasted. Thatch had taught him to eat everything on his plate, not like he needed to be taught that though. "Oi Luffy, whatcha doing over there?" Lucky asked, realizing that the kid had been too quiet. Getting Luffy's attention, he smiled back at the man. "Eating, but this food tastes nasty," he said in return, making the cook realize what Luffy had been eating. "Oi," he shouted, making Marco and Shanks look his way, their brows raised. "Captain, I think we have a problem. Luffy just ate our devil fruit," he said, making both men pale then panic. Shanks was the first to react. He jumped up, grabbing Luffy, turning him upside down, and shook him, trying to get him to spit up the fruit. "Throw it up, spit it up, I don't care, just get it all out of your stomach, brat." While he was shaking Luffy, his legs stretched and the kid face planted the floor. Shanks paled further while Marco just rubbed his forehead in annoyance. It was one thing after another. "What devil fruit was it, Yui?" Marco asked, his head in his hands. Luffy took notice of Marco's tone and got worried. The Gomu Gomu no mi. He's now a rubber human, Shanks said with a sigh, making Luffy feel worse. When Shanks put him down, Luffy looked at his two friends and saw they were upset. He felt awful. What are the people going to think of him now? Those who have the powers of a devil fruit are often looked down upon, Yoi. Marco said to Shanks, who nodded his head in understanding. He'll be seen as a freak or a monster in some communities. Life will get harder, Shanks replied without thinking, making Luffy tear up. Before anyone had realized it, Luffy bolted from the room, reminding the two men that he was even there in the first place. He raced past the Akagami crew, ran over the board connecting the two ships, and ran past his family straight towards his father. When Luffy jumped into the older man's lap and began to cry, Whitebeard raised his brow in confusion and worry. "What has happened, my son?" he said. Luffy just cried harder, but the older man was patient. Marco said that no one would like me because I'm different, and Shanks said that I'll be called a monster or a freak. He cried again. This time Whitebeard wanted some answers. Marco came flying in and landed right in front of his pops. "Is he okay, Yoi?" Marco asked, seeing Luffy was on the man's lap. "He's told me quite the story. Care to explain?" Pops asked Marco, who looked down in shame. "We spoke without thinking. Sometimes it's hard to remember that he's a child, Yoi." Marco started looking at the kid. "He ate a devil fruit, the Gomu Gomu no mi, Yoi," Marco said, making Whitebeard understand now. "Luffy, your brother didn't mean to hurt you," the older man said to the child, who looked up at him slightly. "He was worried about how people outside of the crew might think of you, not how we think of you," he said. This time Luffy sat up to look at his father. "So I'm not a monster?" he asked softly to the older man. "Gurarara, you're no more a monster than Marco or myself, brat." This time Luffy looked down at Marco, who turned his arm into a flaming blue wing for Luffy to see. "Pops, Jozu, and I are just a few of those who have devil fruit powers on this crew. You're just a new addition, Yoi," Marco said, smiling up at his brother. Luffy smiled in return. "Nay Luffy, as an apology, would you like to fly?" Marco asked him with a wide smile. Luffy looked up towards Pops for permission before jumping into Marco's open arms. He said, making the men chuckle. Marco swung Luffy from his arms to his back with the kid's arms around his neck, telling him to hold on tight before turning himself into his full phoenix form. Taking off, Luffy felt the wind through his hair, but the warmth of Marco made him feel safe. The Moby and the Red Force turned to small ships from above. Luffy learned at that moment that he loved to fly. Marco smiled as the child was left breathe less from everything that was happening. He should have shown Luffy this sooner. They flew for a few hours. Marco enjoyed stretching his wings. It had been so long since he flew so carefree, and Luffy's weight felt like nothing on his strong back. By the time they returned back to the ship, Shanks was packing up and ready to leave. "Shanks, sorry for running off like that and eating your devil fruit," Luffy said to the man, who patted his head in understanding. "I'm sorry for yelling at you and saying mean things," he said in return. "I'm going to miss you," he said to Shanks, making the captain smile. "You're going to be a pirate, right? What kind of pirate will you be? Are you going to stay here? Someday be a commander? Or will you someday come join my crew?" he asked Luffy, who looked up at Shanks before smiling a mischievous grin. "Someday, I'm going to find a crew stronger than yours, stronger than Pops, and I'll become the Pirate King," he shouted for both crews to hear. "Oh, so you want to surpass us, eh?" Shanks asked the kid, who nodded his head, a look of pure confidence on his face. Shanks took his straw hat off his head, looked at it for a moment, smiled, and placed it on Luffy's head. "Then someday when you become a great pirate, return this hat to me in great condition. This hat is very important to me, Luffy. That's our promise." Luffy began to cry at the amount of faith Shanks was giving to him. Luffy would treasure this hat from this day forth. "He's going to be big someday," Ben said to Shanks with a smile that Shanks returned. "I know, I can't wait," he said before the anchor was lifted off. A pair of hands came up and pulled the boy close. "Looks like we got another anchor on the crew," Thatch said, releasing Luffy from his hug. "I'll learn to swim still," he said, pulling his new hat tighter on his head. "Didn't anyone tell you? Those who eat the devil fruits are cursed by the sea. They will never ever swim," Thatch said dramatically, making Luffy open his mouth as shock. "Well, I'll be strong enough that I won't need to swim," he shouted and ran off, making everyone laugh in response. "Our little brat's growing up," Thatch said with a mock tear in his eye. Yeah, pretty soon he'll want to join in on our battles. Namur said, slightly annoyed at all the work he put in to teach the kid to swim was gone. Not yet, Yui. He's got a long way to go before he can make his promise come true. The king of the pirates. Just what kind of brat are we raising? Marco said, shaking his head with a smile. The best kind. Thatch replied, laughing. Thatchy. What brat? It was early in the morning and the cooks hadn't yet started breakfast, so Thatch saw no plausible reason to be woken up. The sun's out, Luffy said excitedly, jumping around the older man's bed. Then go wake up Marco, I'm still sleeping, he mumbled, trying to close his eyes from the light coming through his now open door. I tried, but he said to go bug you, Luffy said, stomping his foot in irritation. Thatch groaned, making plans for pineapple chicken to be on the menu at dinner time. He realized now that it was quite cold in his room, making him pull his blanket up and tighter. Come play Thatchy, Luffy said, trying to pull off his blankets, making the straw hat fall on the ground. Luffy panicked when it fell, making the man open his eyes to realize Luffy was only in his underwear and a tank top shirt in this cold room. Play later, aren't you cold, bud? Thatch said with one eye open. He hated the fact he was starting to wake up. I'm cold, he shouted, suddenly wrapping his arms around himself after putting his straw hat back on his head. Thatch laughed softly and opened the blankets for the kid to climb into. Once in, Luffy snuggled up to Thatch and chattered about everything before falling promptly asleep himself, making the man smile. The kid was never boring, that he could say. Oi, you guys getting up anytime soon, Yoi? Marco asked, standing inside of Thatch's room looking at the pair all wrapped up in their blanket. Do we have ta? Thatch whined, hugging Luffy tighter. The kid was a heater, he needed to have the kid sleep over more often. You'll miss breakfast, Marco said, knowing the effect it would have. Don't eat all the meat, Luffy shouted, waking up immediately while throwing his hands in the air, punching Thatch in the chin while making Marco smile in amusement. We are so having pineapple chicken for dinner tonight, Thatch said in annoyance as his heater jumped into Marco's arms. Let's get you dressed, Brad, it's cold outside, Marco said to the smiling and drooling child. Chicken, he muttered before realizing Marco had said something. Cold? I was cold earlier. Why is it cold? He chattered to the man who was looking towards Thatch. He still has some clothes in here, right? I don't plan to bring him out in what he's wearing now, Yoi, Marco said to Thatch, who was rubbing his chin. Yeah, in the top drawer, he pointed out, getting a nod from Marco as he searched for suitable clothing for the 6-year-old. It's cold out because we're nearing a winter island, Yoi. Marco could literally see the sparkles in the kid's eyes. Amazing, he shouted while lifting his arms for Marco to pull the shirt over him. Does that mean snow? Thatch asked, putting on his own clothing. Marco just smiled. Well, let's go get breakfast, Yoi, he said, making the now fully clothed and straw-hatted child jump back into his arms. Opening the door, Luffy's eyes widened at the white snow that covered the deck. He wanted to touch it, but Marco held a firm grip on the kid. After we eat you can play all you want, Yoi, he said, smiling at the kid, knowing that no matter what his stomach would win out every time. MN, he said. Thatch laughed at him. When they got to the galley, the commanders listened to Luffy talk about how excited he was for the snow, all while shoveling down enough food to feed a grown man. Once he finished, he grabbed Thatch's hand and dragged him outside to play with him. Thatch loved snow for as long as he could remember. He's loved it for its beauty and playfulness. He started to roll the snow into balls, confusing Luffy. What cha doin', Thatchy? Luffy tilted his head in question. I'm about to teach you the mastery of making snowmen, Thatch grinned while still rolling his ball. Snowman? So cool, Luffy shouted, the stars returning to his eyes. He helped build that snowman with Thatch, making the snowman look like Thatch himself. Luffy deciding he needed more snowmen so the Thatch snowman wouldn't be lonely, he ran back into the galley only to return with Jozu and Marco in tow. He made them help build snowmen with him. When Jozu tried to back out, Luffy gave him the puppy eyes. He was finished from there. Before anyone really knew it, the commanders were out making snowmen with Luffy while Pops sat on his throne watching his children having fun. That was until Marco threw the first snowball. Looking at the commander, he hid with a lazy grin. He ducked as one was sent his way in return. Suddenly a ginormous snowball fight had broken out among the crew. Whitebeard even stepped in to play with everyone under the conditions that when his nurses said enough it would be. Luffy was shorter than everyone else, making it both hard and easy to throw at the same time. Pops finding Luffy picked the kid up, putting him on his shoulders and passing snowballs up to him to throw. Everyone was laughing by dinner time when they were all called in for food and cups of hot chocolate. Though most of the crew had a bit of alcohol in their drinks, Luffy loved the taste of his with milk. After dinner, Luffy went out to play once more. His jacket and snow pants covered new pants and a sweater to keep him warmer as the temperature dropped. When Marco and Thatch went to check on him, though knowing he was safe, Pops was out there. They found him asleep in the middle of making his 13th snow angel. They smiled and picked him up, bringing him to his room for the night. Thatch let Marco finish putting the kid to bed. It was only fair. He woke up with the kid so Marco could get the good nights. Placing a kiss on Luffy's forehead, he whispered good night and placed the straw hat on the desk before closing the door. He walked over and wished his father good night as he himself headed for bed. Who knew a 6-year-old could make the snow sparkle brighter than ever? "Come on, Marco. I want to go now," Luffy said with a hint of annoyance. Marco's speech was cutting into his adventure time. Alright, let's go, Brad. You need to hold my hand though, okay, yo?" he said, earning a smile and a frantic nodding of a little straw-hatted head. Thatch had wandered off on the island saying something about pretty girls and not needing to disappoint, but Luffy didn't pay much attention to him, his own excitement keeping him occupied. Marco was being dragged towards the buzzing town where Luffy had seen a few of the other crew members wander towards an excitement that was contagious. "Our first stop is to place the order, Yoi. Try and be good in the shop, alright?" he asked the kid, who was just smiling looking at everything around him. When they arrived at the shop, the store owner came running out to greet them. Luffy, not one to be shy, said his hellos before he started to run around the shop, exploring while he could. The workers chased him around, begging the kid not to touch anything important or break anything. The owner paid all his attention to Marco, who told him what was needed and gave the list out as a reminder. Once Marco had finished paying for the supplies, he thanked the owner, who bowed rather deeply to the commander, who just waved it off, then called Luffy down from the top shelf. Luffy, hearing Marco call for him, jumped into the man's arms and laughed. The workers seemed thankful to watch the boy go, but Luffy waved his goodbyes and thanked them for playing with him. Marco couldn't stop the laugh at the child's innocence. They moved from store to store, buying supplies and giving lists out to different people to get ready before they left in the few days. Luffy was having fun spending his time with Marco, but saw a few children playing in the streets. Luffy had never seen other children before, so he was a bit curious as to what it might be like to talk to them. Pulling on Marco's sleeve to get his attention, he pointed out the kids and asked if he could go play with them. Marco, taking the opportunity to let Luffy have time with other children his age, agreed to let him play as long as he didn't go anywhere. Marco, heading into his next shop, watched as Luffy wandered off to introduce himself, couldn't help but smile. His little brother was starting to grow up. If Luffy was really planning on gathering a crew someday, he knew that he would have to let him go and meet new people. To learn to trust others like he trusted them. Shaking his head, he called over the shopkeeper. Luffy was actually feeling a bit nervous about talking to them. He had never met anyone his age and didn't know just what to say to them. He took a deep breath and smiled, saying hello. The kids looked up, startled that someone they didn't know was talking to them. "I'm Luffy, can I play with you guys?" They all looked at each other before smiling. "Sure, kid," one said, holding a ball under his arm. "We're about to play soccer. Know how to play?" another boy asked with a grin. Luffy shook his head and tried to listen to the instructions, but only coming to grips of it being a mystery game. The boys looked at each other confused but let it go. Once gathered into teams, the boys kicked past each other trying to score goals. Luffy catching the ball, and because he watched what the other kids did, he figured it would be cool to show off and score a goal of his own. He stretched his leg back past everyone, bringing it back, hitting the ball, sending it flying into the goalie kid, making him fly back and hit a wall with an oof. Everyone froze before suddenly a few kids ran towards the one that got hurt. Luffy moved towards the kid to apologize but was pushed down. "What a freak!" one kid shouted towards him. "He hurt Joe. Monsters should be kept away from others," another kid said, glaring at Luffy. "Did you see what he did with his leg?" a voice said in fear. "He's more than a monster, he's a demon," a voice said with more fear lining it. Luffy looked around in panic, his body shaking. I didn't mean to, it was an accident," he said to them, but the oldest kid, who was closest to him, just glared at him. "Get out of here, you freak. There's no place for a creature like you," he shouted in fear and anger. Luffy just got up and ran. He ran to the shop Marco was in and latched himself to the man's leg. Looking down at the sudden pressure, Marco smiled before putting his hand on Luffy's head only to feel him shaking. The smile dropped instantly. "Ma, can we go home now?" he whispered, calling Marco by his childish nickname, making Marco worry more. He bent down and looked Luffy in the eyes. Seeing the tears ready to fall, he said he would be back later. The owner picked the boy up and headed back to the Mobi. The kids were all gone from the area. Luffy was silent the whole way home. Marco cuddled him close until the shaking stopped, but the sadness didn't leave. "Do you want to talk about it, Yoi?" he asked Luffy once he was back on the ship. Luffy just shook his head no, looking towards the ground. Marco didn't press on. Luffy would talk when he was ready. Once dinner rolled around, the crewmates had made their way back to the ship, each laughing, telling stories of their time there. Luffy was silent and picked at his food, not really interested in it at all. "Common brat, eat your food. It'll get cold and we don't waste on this ship," Thatch said to Luffy, expecting him to react in the usual goofy way, but was severely disappointed when Luffy just lowered his head, his hat covering his eyes. "I'm not hungry," he said quietly, but the amount of forks that dropped and mouths that opened made up for the noise. Even Whitebeard went still and began to analyze his youngest son. "What's wrong with him? Is he sick? Did he eat something bad on the island?" Thatch was all in the kid's face, checking him, looking him over, feeling his head only to be brushed off. "Luffy, what's wrong, Yoi?" Marco said, no longer able to keep quiet. The tears Luffy had been holding back for a while started to fill his eyes again. He gripped the table and tried to look away. Everyone was watching him, not really sure what to expect. When Luffy did look up again, he had a smile on his face and laughed. "Nothing's wrong, I'm just not that hungry today," he stated in a forced voice that made the crew present frown deeply. It was Pops who got up and knelt down in front of the kid. "What has happened, my son?" he said softly. Luffy, trying to keep his smile on, just shook his head, but a tear slipped past his defense. Whitebeard picked the kid up and excused himself from the galley, knowing Luffy needed to be alone. Bringing Luffy to his room, he placed him on the bed and sat down, waiting for him to talk. He didn't wait long. "I saw kids playing, I wanted to play too," he sniffed, more tears coming. Whitebeard just nodded his head, remaining silent, listening. "They wanted to play a game with a b-ball and I saw how they kicked it, so I thought I'd try too," he said through his tears. Taking another sniff, he continued. "I thought if I showed them my new powers they would think it was cool, but I hurt one of them," he cried. Whitebeard nodded in sadness. He knew how hard it was to control a devil fruit power in the beginning. "Pa, am I a monster?" he whispered, his eyes wide open in fear. Whitebeard wasn't going to have any of that. "You're not, you're the furthest thing from a monster," he said simply to the kid, who looked up towards his father. "Do you think you're a monster?" He let the boy think for a moment before he shook his head as no. Whitebeard smiled at him. "Then you are not," he said again. The kid looked at him still. They said there was no place for me to belong. I don't want to be alone," he said. Whitebeard was getting annoyed at those kids. How dare they treat his son like this? "You belong here. You're my son and I will always love you," he said, making Luffy smile for the first time that night. Getting into the bed, he let Luffy lay his head against his chest. "Do you know the story of the Pirate King?" he asked the cuddling boy. "Shan at him, but not much," he mumbled. "Well, let me tell you the story of the man who became the king of the pirates." He began his tale, and by the end of it Luffy fell asleep. A knock was made on his door, calling for them to come in softly. Marco and Thatch entered, looking worried. "Is he okay, Yoi?" Marco asked, first looking softly towards the sleeping child on his father's chest. "He was rejected by the other children," was all the older man said, making Thatch curse, and Marco frowned. "But Luffy is kind, sure he's excitable but not mean by far, Yoi," Marco defended, making the older man smile towards his sons. "He used his fruit power, saying he hurt one by accident." Thatch looked sad. "That's the cure of the devil fruits. Can't swim and people fear you. Thank God I haven't found one," he said, shaking his head. "He'll need us to bring his confidence back up," Thatch said softly. "Now he'll be fine. Those kids weren't worthy of his friendship anyways. Someday he'll find the right people. People that will accept and love him for who he is, devil fruit or not. And when he does, we'll welcome them, Yoi," Marco said, smiling. "He's going to be the Pirate King after all, right, Pops?" Thatch said with a grin that made the older man smile. "Do you want me to take him to his room, Yoi?" Marco asked, moving forward, but the man just smiled and said no to let the boy rest. Marco nodded and bid his father good night before he headed towards his own room. Splitting off from Thatch, he though back to the smile Luffy gave at dinner time. It was forced and sad, it was fake, and he hoped never to ever see that smile again. He would give anything to ensure that. When Luffy woke up that morning, he was feeling a lot better than he had all week. Since the trip to that island, he had discovered he was becoming anxious around the idea of meeting people outside of the crew. Marco pointing out the anxiety, meaning it was time to sit the kid down to have a long talk. He let Luffy talk about his feelings and what bothered him, where Marco listened and told him to not worry so much. That there were other people out there who not only would love to meet him but are waiting for it to happen. He reminded Luffy that if he was afraid of everyone he met, then there was a big chance he would miss out on those people waiting for him. Luffy became more afraid of that idea than being rejected again. Marco was thankful for that idea and bought Thatch some good sake for helping him come up with that plan. Luffy, getting his clothes on as best as he could, ran out the room and towards the smell of bacon. When he got to the galley, Aizu stopped him to help turn his shirt the right way around and check him over to make sure the kid was dressed fine. Once he was given the okay, he raced to his spot at the table, waiting excitedly for food. "We'll be stopping at Sabati quickly to get coded before heading back to the New World," one member said with a hint of worry in his voice. "While we're there, we should show the kid around," Haruta said with a grin. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," another member said, looking at the kid who was stuffing his face with bacon and eggs. Everyone was still worried about their little brother. That adventure that turned bad really left them rattled. The fake smile lingering in their minds and questions of where and when he learned how to use it. Luffy had trouble on an island they docked at for supplies. What would happen if he was taken to Sabati, an island that was truly a nightmare that was dressed as a daydream? "We'll discuss it with Pops later. He's on the Den Den Mushi right now," Thatch said, sitting down beside Luffy, who was too into his food to look up. "Who's he talking to?" Vista asked, raising an eyebrow in interest. "Garp," Thatch said, suddenly making everyone go still and glance at their 6-year-old brother. Garp was probably not a good sign. "What does he want?" Cruel asked Thatch, who just shrugged his shoulders. "Pops said he wanted to talk to him alone, that's all," he said, watching his bottomless pit of a brother start to reach for Thatch's plate. "We'll deal with that as it comes," Haruta said, worry clearly on her face, but nothing she could about it. When it came down to it, they would protect their brother from anyone and everyone, even the kid's grandfather. "Luffy, once you're finished eating, I'd like to see you on deck, Yoi," Marco said with a small smile, entering the galley. Luffy swallowed his last fork full of eggs, knowing he wasn't getting any of Thatch as he grinned back at Marco and got up excitedly to follow him. "Luffy, Pops and I have decided that you need to learn how to fight properly, Yoi." He looked down at the child, whose eyes widened in excitement. "I get to learn how to fight?" he shouted happily. "Of course, we are having a strong pipe being built for you to use as a weapon. Until then we will be working on your devil fruit powers, Yoi," he said to the child, who started to jump around happily. "We know you have eaten the Gomu Gomu, no am I making you a rubber man? We know that blunt attacks like hitting you won't hurt you. We just need to see what might hurt you so we can prevent that, Yoi." Luffy looked at Marco, but the way his eyes glazed over told the man he caught nothing of what was just said. "So I have a mystery power," he said excitedly. Marco just shook his head and sighed. "Sure, why not, Yoi?" He sighed through his hand, knowing that big words and sentences would make him lose the boy's attention altogether. "Aizu will be working on your aiming 2 times a week, Thatch and Vista will be working on your pipe skills for 3 hours every day. Haruta will be giving you as much information on your devil fruit as possible as often as she can. I will be doing whatever is left over, Yoi." He knew Luffy didn't get it, so he smiled at the thought of him writing it all down to remember. Luffy couldn't wait to start training to finally learn how to protect himself so his brothers didn't have to worry so much. "We start tomorrow, so be ready, alright brat?" Thatch had come out and placed his arm around Luffy, picking him up into a bear hug. Luffy's laughter rang across the ship, making those who passed by smile and laugh with him. Garp was in a panic. His eldest grandson's safety was on the line. Sengoku called him in to talk about rumors that had started to spread of the Pirate King's son being in the East Blue. Garp waved it off and said rumors are not true. Sengoku gave the man a long hard look before smiling at him. "Of course, but that doesn't mean we can't be careful," he said to Garp, who was internally freaking out. I do believe we have extra funding to spare, so why not put it to this? Garp laughed his booming laugh and called Sengoku an idiot for wasting money before excusing himself. Garp walked faster towards his office, giving his comrade a nod, stating he wanted time alone. Pulling out a Den Den Mushi, he glared at it before picking up the dial. He didn't wait for an answer when he heard the other side connect. Whitebeard, it's me. We need to talk. I am in need of a favor. Ace was furious. The man he called Gramps had decided out of nowhere it was time for him to be uprooted from the bandits he'd been living with and placed on marine ship heading out to sea. He was being taken away from his home. Everything he had grown and come to see as his was now gone. His forest, his money, everything. He was fuming. Calm down, seriously. Sabo said from beside him in their hiding spot. The old geezer'll find us. He hissed, glaring at the raven-headed boy beside him. At least Sabo was there. If his friend hadn't come along, he'd be even more pissed. Any clue yet as to where we're going? Sabo asked, making Ace look towards his friend in annoyance. Like I'm hanging around that old man long enough to ask anything. He'll kill me, he said back to the blonde in anger. Sabo shook his head in worry. Sure, he was grateful to be taken away from his hateful parentage, but he was just as confused as Ace on everything else. There you boys are, said a voice from above them, making their eyes widen and hearts slow down. Now how about we continue our training? Luffy was running top speed through the ship, a big smile on his face. Pops! He yelled, laughing loudly. The old man smiled in return when Luffy held up a yellow banana to his nose and said, "Look, I'm just like you now." He giggled in delight, pretending to have a yellow mustache. "Gurararara. You need to grow a lot more to be like me, brat." He smiled, allowing the kid to climb up and eat his fruit in peace. Marco had made it clear that all candy was banned from the ship due to the little hyperball that Luffy became with a small amount of it. Instead, Thatch had agreed that sweet fruits were okay. Bananas, apples, tangerines were all a welcome thing, and Luffy didn't seem to mind that much. Of course, that didn't stop him from asking for the sweets now missing. "Luffy, how has your training coming along?" he asked the kid seriously. Luffy had taken up training with the commanders throughout the week. He first complained about not being able to just use his bare fists to hit, but got over it when his pipe arrived. "I still keep hitting myself, it's annoying," he said, puffing out his cheeks. "Gurarara, you'll get the hang of it soon enough." He patted the small child's head. "But I learned a new super cool move that can deflect anything," he said cheerfully, making the older man's brow raise. Luffy hopped down off his knee and sucked in air, blowing himself up like a balloon. Whitebeard couldn't help but chuckle. It was more adorable than anything, but he knew not to say that. When Luffy unballooned himself, he smiled up at his father, who smiled right back at him. Whitebeard patted his leg again, letting the kid know he was to climb back up. "Luffy, I need to talk to you about something," he said in a serious voice. Not used to be talked to like that, he tried his very best to pay attention. "Very soon we will have 2 more people joining us." He started making Luffy smile. He loved having brothers and sisters, the more the merrier. "They will be children around your age." The smile faltered very slightly, but the older man caught it. He knew Luffy was weary around children now due to his time on that island. He had hoped it would have disappeared by now. As soon as it had fallen, he pulled it back on. "So there will be kids like me here at home? Cool," he said excitedly and laughed, but it sounded slightly forced. "Yes, you never know, you might just get along with them. Why don't you try and make them your nakama?" he said, catching the boy's attention. Nakama weren't just friends, weren't just family. Nakama means forever. He looked at his father figure with wide eyes willed with hope. "Nakama," he trailed off in wonder, his worries fading away. "Also, you will meet your grandfather," he said, pulling the kid's eyes back. "Grandfather? I have a grandfather?" he said with a head tilt. "Garara, you do, brat. His name is Garp. He's a Marine Vice Admiral." Whitebeard said, watching Luffy process everything that was happening. Marine? Aren't they the people who make Marco mad and all flammy? Whitebeard knew he was referring to the one time a Marine shot a cannonball too close to where Luffy was watching and Marco flamed up all blue and defensive, sinking the battleship in a matter of seconds. Yes, but he is your family, so be nice, he said, patting the kid's head. MN. He nodded, hoping off of Whitebeard's lap. And where do you think you're going? He asked him with a grin. To the kitchen. I want more popsnainers. They tasted great, he said, pointing to the now finished banana peel, making the old man laugh loudly, making the crew around him smile, glad to see their father so lively and their brother bonding. If I'm going to be as big as you, I gotta eat lots of them, he said with his grin before running off. Are we sure about letting him meet Garp, yo? Marco said, flying down from the crow's nest with a look of concern on his lazy face. Garp is his blood family. Keeping them apart will not help. The man needs a favor. This is something he would never ask for. Marco looked at the older man. Just be careful. You and Garp may have a peaceful relationship, but if he so much as touches my brother, I'll show him why I'm the first commander, yo. Marco said, jumping down from where he was and trailing off after Luffy to make sure he didn't eat all of the bananas and everything else they had in the kitchen. The son of Dragon and the son of Roger on one ship. Gurara, things are about to get interesting. He smiled, listening to his family all around him. The thunder crashed from above and lightning flashed through the ship. Of course, living in the new world, this wasn't uncommon, but this night was very loud and the storm was very close. Luffy woke abruptly in panic that one was louder than the last one. He felt alone in his room all by himself. He wanted his brothers. Grabbing his old bear and putting his hat on his head, Luffy quickly got up and waited for the loud boom before opening his door and running as fast as he could. He was getting soaked by the rain, but he didn't care, he just didn't want to be alone. Reaching the closest of his brother's rooms, he opened the door and shuffled inside. Thatchy. He sniffled out, shivering from being wet. Thatch rolled over at the new noise in his room to see his little Luffy shaking. Panicking, he jumped out of bed and checked him over. You're soaked. He freaked, pulling the wet clothes off of the kid and placing the hat on his dresser before wrapping him in a blanket. Luffy was still cold but pulled the blanket tighter around himself. Damn it. All your clothes are in the washing area. You'll have to wear one of my shirts tonight. Is that okay, Lou? Luffy shakily nodded his head, allowing Thatch to pull one of his larger shirts over his small body. He was still cold though, so he climbed back into Thatch's bed to warm up. What you doing running out here in a storm? Thatch asked him, sounding a bit angry, but really it was worry. I had a bad dream and the loud monster outside woke me up. He sniffled, starting to remember the reason he woke up in the first place. Do you want to tell me about your dream? Thatch asked softly, pulling the kid closer to him to give the boy more heat. A monster ate you. Tears started to fill his eyes at the memory. Thatch couldn't help but laugh. A monster ate me? What kind of monster? He knew he should be taking this seriously by the puffing of Luffy's cheeks, but he wanted to cheer his brother up. It was a big dark monster that had a mean laugh. He hurt you and I was sad, he said. Thatch pulled him even closer than already. I'm not going anywhere, bud. No monster can touch me or you for that matter. We're on the safest ship in the world. He ran his fingers through Luffy's dark hair in soothing motions until the kid smiled and hugged his brother, falling asleep. By the afternoon of that day, Luffy was walking around rather tired looking. What's up with him, Yoi? Marco said, pointing to the kid who had crawled up Whitebeard's leg to rest on the man's lap. He was fine this morning. He ate more than I did, but he always does, Vista said, looking towards the clingy child. He had a nightmare last night, Thatch said, coming up behind them, making them look his way. He came to my room in the middle of the night and told me about his dream. Marco looked back over to the kid. It was raining pretty hard last night. He must have gotten wet, Yoi. Marco was worried. Whitebeard smiled fondly at the kid who was now sleeping up against him. He was soaked. I dried him off as best as I could and gave him a shirt to wear. He slept fine once he had someone with him. Thatch smiled at the memory of Luffy cuddling him in the morning. Luffy slept on Whitebeard's lap for the rest of the afternoon. The older man didn't mind it. He enjoyed the company of his youngest son. That's when he sensed it. Looking down at the sleeping boy, he began to frown. Luffy's cheeks were red and his breathing had started to come faster. Marco, he called the lazy man, appearing at his side in an instant. What wrong, Yoi? He looked over his father to make sure he was okay. "Call Myra, it appears your brother may be sick." Marco's eyes widened before dropping to where the kid was. Marco ran to the infirmary without even stopping to look who was in his way. He grabbed the head nurse despite her surprise, quickly explaining the situation and running back with her right behind him. "Move," was all she said, and Minnie got out of her way. She walked up to Pops and looked at the small child. Whitebeard lifted the boy off his lap into her arms where she could study him better. "He's going to need to spend some time with me." And like that she was up and on her way back to infirmary, a trail of siblings right behind her. "He needs rest. I don't need all of you bothering him," she said, glaring at her family before closing the door in their faces. Marco sat down, Thatch coming up beside him. "This is my entire fault. I should have dried him off better," he said, sounding deflated. "It was not. Things happen, Yui. He was bound to catch something sooner or later." Though he sounded worried. Looking over to Thatch, he smiled. "What was his dream about Yui?" Marco asked him, making Thatch grin a little. "He said a big dark monster ate me and heard a scary laugh. He's turning 7 soon. Nightmares aren't uncommon at that age," Thatch said, but Marco looked thoughtful. "He's intuitive. He can almost see the good and bad in people. Sometimes it scares even me how good he is at reading people's hearts, Yui." Marco looked at the infirmary door. "Yet he can't see through the easiest lies. What a strange brother we have," Thatch said with a smile. Myra looked the kid over and sighed. He was sick, but with nothing more than a small fever and a cold. The way everyone acted, it was if he was dying. She loved her family very much, but sometimes they could be the biggest mother hens around. "Luffy will be fine. Within a few days he'll be jumping around causing trouble once again," she said to the waiting crowd that surrounded her door. "He has a small cold due to the storm, meaning he will be resting in here where we will be keeping an eye on him." She smiled at the relieved faces. "Can he have visitors?" Thatch asked, standing up. She just moved out of the way as a few people went in to see for themselves. Luffy was sleeping soundly, his cheeks still red but not as warm. "You'll be alright, brat. You're loved too much to stay down too long," Haruta said, checking in on her brother. "We can't keep training you if you don't get better, Lou," Aizu said with a soft smile. Once the family had checked on him and cleared out Marco, and Thatch sat down beside the kid's bed. "Ma, Thatchy," he said, waking up slowly, his voice sounding a bit raw. "Here, take a sip," Thatch said, taking a cup of water from the side table and handing it to the boy. "MNN," he said, drinking it, feeling a bit better. "Has he woken up?" Myra came over, putting her hand to his forehead, taking his temperature. "You're warm, Luffy. I'll keep you here overnight to watch over you," she said. Luffy's eyes widened. "I don't want to be alone. What if the scary monster comes back?" he shouted in a panic. "Then we'll be close by to fight it off. You need to get better, Lu Yui," Marco said, ruffling his hair. The kid sighed and fell back onto the sheets. Thatch pulled his blanket up to his chin to keep him warm. "Tell me a story," Luffy asked his brothers, not caring which one spoke first. "What kind of story, bud?" Thatch asked him, lying on his side on the bed with Luffy. Marco taking up Luffy's other side. "Something magical," he said softly, dozing off. "Okay, once upon a time there was." Thatch started. Marco filled in places that may have needed extra information, but by the end Luffy was asleep, and so were the two grown men. Myra came in to yell at the two men to get out and let the boy rest, but saw them all cuddled up together and smiled. Grabbing a camera, she took a picture of the scene to show the old man later and even use as blackmail if necessary. Luffy may have caught his first cold, but he had his family there to make him feel better always. XX. Ace was hiding in a new spot, and this time he was alone. When Gramps found them, he beat them both senseless. This time if they split up, it would take him a lot longer to find him. He nodded his head in agreement with himself. Sitting in his spot, he wondered where Sabo had gone off to, and though he never would, friend was okay. Time ticked by and no one had even passed his spot. At first he was grinning, so happy he was safe, but hours passed. The sun rose and was now falling in the sky. Ace can handle a lot of things. Being hit, being alone, being hated, but he couldn't handle being hungry. Hunger was never a good thing, and he always worked to get his meals. Realizing that the old man wasn't coming, he got up from his spot, looked both ways, and ran as fast as he could towards the ship's galley. Thinking he was home free just this once, he laughed out loud until a loud thump sounded in front of him and a large man with shadows cast over his body appeared. So there you are, Ace. I was starting to think you were going to miss dinner. He trailed off. Ace paled but refused to take a step back. Your friend was found an hour ago. He took his punishment well. Ace thought about praying for Sabo but decided to worry about himself first. Now why don't we start a quick lesson before dinner? And he punched. Ace could only scream and run. Worst adventure out to sea ever. He thought while running for his life, Garp trailing behind him, fists flying, aiming to damage, and nowhere for Ace to escape. Luffy was coloring on the figurehead of the Moby, happily singing a song about islands and idiots. He couldn't really remember, he was still working out the words, but he'll have it someday. Anyways, Luffy was on the figurehead drawing pictures of all of his family. He drew himself with as many members as possible, showing him and that person doing something fun. He had Marco and when they flew in the sky. Thatch and the pranks they played on his division, those are fun. He had Pops and the stories he tells, and Aizu teaching him to aim his rubbery arm. Why was Luffy drawing everyone having fun with him? Well, that was because apparently his grandfather was coming today. Luffy had never met his grandfather, but he had heard a lot of stories about him. Luffy was excited to say the least, not just because of the grandfather coming but because there was going to be new people on the ship, 2 kids like him. He couldn't wait to meet them but hoped they would like him. He didn't do well the last time he met kids, so he was understandably worried. Marco had wandered up to the crow's nest to keep a lookout on both any ships heading their way and the little boy on the figurehead lying on his stomach happily drawing. That morning Pops got a call saying that the 2 new boys would be dropped off that afternoon, meaning Garp the Fist was on his way. This worried Marco a lot. He cared deeply for Luffy and didn't want to see him hurt, but at the same time he knew the kid was going to have to meet his grandfather sooner or later. It might as well be here at home where he is safe and surrounded in brothers than out at sea where he couldn't be protected. Also, the 2 new boys worried him a lot as well. They were apparently 3 years older than Luffy, making them 10. Pops said their names were Ace and Sabo. Why he sounded excited about knowing the kids Marco didn't know. What cha doing, brat? Thatch had climbed onto the figurehead to sit down beside Luffy. Drawing, he said, laughing and pushing a few drawings over to the man to look at. You. Good drawings, kid. Is that Namur right there? Thatch said, pointing to a figure in the paper he was holding, only to get a scowl from Luffy. No, that's Marco. See his hair? Luffy pointed out, making Thatch laugh uncontrollably. You're right, looks just like him. He joked, making Marco's brow twitch from where he was sitting in the crow's nest. I know, right? Luffy laughed along with his brother for completely different reasons. Why are you sitting here though? Thatch asked him. He was worried about the kid being so far away from safety. He could feel Marco's watching eyes from above, so he knew the kid was relatively safe, but he didn't like to chance it. This is my spot, he said simply. Thatch looked the kid over as the boy looked up from his drawing and out towards the sea. But I thought the spot in front of Pops is your spot, he asked the boy who didn't look away from his view. It is, but here I can see both the sky and the sea at the exact same time, he said softly, not looking away. That is true, Thatch agreed, joining in the calm atmosphere with the kid. If the Brad did fulfill his dream and become the Pirate King, then this would be his ocean. Thatch smiled at the though. Luffy was already making himself a throne to watch over what was his right before he even knew what he was doing. What a kid. Marco was listening to the pair and smiled softly towards them. His best friend and his little brother Bello in the sea and sky in view. Luffy was right, this was amazing. Do you want to go show Pops your drawings? Thatch asked him, but Luffy shook his head. I want to draw everything and give it to my grandpa. That way he can see that I have lots of fun and I'm really happy, he said with his wide toothy grin, his straw hat hanging from a strong around his neck. Aizu had attached a string when the hat was blown off his little head and into the water. Luffy, in his panic to get the hat, jumped overboard, making Namur have to jump in after both him and the hat. It was an experience that no one wanted to happen again, but sadly the kid just couldn't stay out of the water. Being a devil fruit user, he sunk like an anchor, he was every time. Thatch laughed at the memory, confusing Luffy. You're just cute, kid, he said, ruffling his black hair. I'm cool, not cute, cute is for girls, he said in annoyance to Thatch, who bent down and whispered. Deal with it, kid, you're cute. Luffy puffed his cheeks and punched Thatch in the knee before the man straightened up with a laugh. You have to grow some more before you can be classified as cool, he smiled down at the annoyed child. I will be the strongest, then I'll beat you up, Luffy stood up quickly and stomped his foot, making his crayons roll away from him. You tell yourself that, Lu. He chuckled and looked up at Marco, who was grinning lazily at the pair. When you're bigger, Lu, I'll help you beat him up, Yoi. Marco laughed. Thatch grinned mischievously at him. Oh, I can't wait. Thatch really couldn't. He wanted to see what the kid could do so badly. He knew someday Luffy probably would be stronger than him, but until then he was going to take the joy in being a big brother. And being a brother came with perks, like picking on his younger. Marco laughed at them again. He was having fun just watching his family. Looking back towards the sea, he saw in the distance a ship approaching. By the way it was sailing, he knew it could only be Garp. Thatch, time to bring Lu to Pops, Marco said, his voice tight. Thatch, who was laughing with Luffy previously, looked at his friend, eyes narrowing. What's wrong? He said in seriousness. Marco looked down at the pair. We have visitors. Boys, do you have everything ready? Garp asked them, looking down at the pair. Ace rolled his eyes and Sabo grinned. They both had no idea what was going on, just that they were being sent away from the ship that had imprisoned them for the past month and a half. Where are we going? You haven't told us anything, Sabo asked in annoyance to the old man, then stepped closer to Ace in case he decided to punch him. You're going to be staying with, somewhere safe, he said, looking in the distance where a large ship was starting to appear. Ace's eyes caught sight of the giant ship and widened. That's a pirate ship. His voice trailed off. He wanted to be a pirate someday, go out to sea, make himself a name of his own. A name bigger than his father's. But lately he and Sabo had had some trouble with pirates back on Dawn Island. Their treasure fund was nearly stolen by a pirate named Blue Jam. They robbed one of his goons and he came after them. Fortunately their treasure was safe, but their dislike grew when the man tried to burn down the Grey Terminal. Sabo had bad memories of that time. His father had come to take him home days before it happened, threatening Ace and making Sabo believe leaving his friend was the best option. On the night they burned the Grey Terminal, Sabo had escaped with plans to go out to sea that morning and be free, but his plan drastically changed when he bumped into Ace, who was running for his life away from the fire. Ace had listened to Sabo's plan, called him stupid, then hit him over the head and said he should wait till they were older. Sabo didn't want to admit it, but in his panic and desperation to get away from his family, he wasn't thinking straight. Ace luckily got him thinking again. Weeks later Garp showed up, said he was taking them to be trained, and here they were heading towards a pirate ship. Remember boys, pirates are not to be trusted. Understand? Garp asked, his arms crossed over his chest and looking straight ahead as they grew ever closer to the ship. MNN. Both boys said quietly, also looking ahead. They were excited but terrified at the exact same time. What if they attacked? What if they threw them off the ship when Garp left? What if? Oi, permission to board. Garp called up to the crew that was surrounding the area where the captain must be. Permission granted. A loud voice called and Garp pushed the boys ahead of him up a ladder onto a large ship. Ace's eyes widened as he took in his surroundings. So this was a real pirate ship. It was nothing like Blue Jam's dying ship back home. His excitement was growing. I gave you the details over the phone, Whitebeard, Garp said, standing behind the boys. Ace turned swiftly and looked at his Gramps. What did he tell this pirate about him? Did he already know about his parentage? Garp didn't look anyway from Whitebeard, who grinned at the man under his large mustache. Of course. He turned his eyes to the boys. Welcome, children, he said to them, who looked up at him. Sabo bowed low, pushing Ace down with him. Polite brats, he chuckled. Garp sighed in relief that Ace didn't act out this one time. Then I'll be leaving, he said, turning away, but Whitebeard called him back. There is one more thing I need to talk to you about. Garp's eyebrow raised in confusion. He thought everything would be taken care of. 7 years ago your son called me requesting to meet, Whitebeard said, looking over the man in front of him. Garp's eyes widened. Dragon? He decided to give the older pirate his full attention this time. Ace and Sabo were curious. They didn't know the old man had a son. Yes, he requested something important from me, he said. Garp was trying to think of anything that Dragon could want from a pirate, especially one as well known as Whitebeard. He couldn't actually think of anything. Dragon wasn't impulsive like him. No, the man was too much like his mother. He introduced me to his son, Whitebeard said. This time Garp froze and his eyes widened. Luffy, who had been in Marco's tight arms, wanted to be let go to meet the new people. He was watching the kids that were standing in front of his pops and thought they looked interesting. And the man that came with them, he looked strong. Luffy, you've met Luffy? Garp whispered, sitting down. This time he himself had never met the child. He had no clue as to even where the kid could be. Dragon had said he was a parent now, but he knew nothing else about the situation. Luffy, hearing his name, gave Marco the eyes. The wide, watery brown eyes that demanded love and attention. Marco tried his hardest not to look at them, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Luffy could get someone to destroy the world through those eyes. Sighing, Marco let Luffy down, who ran past his siblings to stand by his pops. Garp looked at the kid that came running to Whitebeard's side. The brat grabbed hold of Whitebeard's leg and hugged it tight. Garp, I'd like you to meet your grandson, Monkey D. Luffy. Garp's eyes widened as he looked over the boy. Ace and Sabo's eyes widened for different reasons. There was a kid on the ship, and he was touching a powerful pirate. Sabo had studied everything about pirates and knew Whitebeard was said to be one of the most powerful in this sea. He was known as the god of the sea, and here a child was grabbing him so carelessly. Ace considered the boy to be strong if he was living on a pirate ship. He smirked at the thought of getting stronger through the kid. Whitebeard patted Luffy's head and smiled softly down at him. Luffy, this here is your grandpa, Monkey D. Garp. Luffy, who had looked up at his pops to listen to him since Marco said it was good to look at people when they talked, turned his head back towards the man sitting on the deck in his spot. Luffy walked up to him. Garp was frozen with so many thoughts rushing through his brain. Hi, my name's Luffy, he said, giving his signature grin and pulling his hat on his head. Garp looked the kid up and down. When he didn't say anything, Luffy lost his smile a bit and tilted his head to the side in confusion. My name's Garp. I'm your grandpa, he said, the shock starting to wear off and tears building in his eyes. MNN, Marco and Pops told me, he smiled again, and Garp could see it now, the bloodline traits of his family. The dark hair, eyes, the D initial, everything. He pulled the kid into a deep hug. He was so happy to be able to meet him finally. Luffy returned the hug just as happy. Luffy loved hugs and he wanted to meet his grandpa since Marco had mentioned him and Pops had talked more about him. Releasing himself from the hug, Luffy put his hands in his pants and pulled out the drawings he had been working on. I made these for you. He smiled while Garp took the pictures from the boy and looked them over. To be honest, they were awful, but he would treasure them always. Thank you, Luffy, he said, patting the kid's head, making him smile wider. Once he got off his grandpa's lap, he saw the two boys who were watching him in awe. Garp would have punched one of them if they ever handed something like drawings to the man. I'm Luffy. What's your name, buddy? Ace and Sabo looked at each other. I'm Sa. Don't call me buddy, he said to Luffy, who only laughed. She, let's be friends, K, he said, then ran back to Marco, who had stepped out when the boy yelled at Luffy, his instincts telling him to protect his brother at all costs. I'll keep in contact, Whitebeard, Garp said, standing up, brushing off his pants and looking towards the boys. Behave, Ace, Sabo. I'll see you both soon enough. Luffy, I'm glad to have finally met you. Be good for your new brothers, he said while smiling. Luffy waved as his grandpa left the ship back to his own and sailing away. I'll take you to your rooms, Yoi, Marco said to the two boys who were watching Garp's ship sail off in the distance. Sure, Pineapple Head, Sabo said, making a tick appear on Marco's forehead. My name's Marco Yoi. Thatch, you're coming with us. Thatch was on the ground laughing from the remark by Sabo. Of course, he said in agreement while watching TA grin on his face. They can't stay with me, Luffy said, pouting in Marco's arms. Nope, they get their own room, Yoi. Ace was starting to reevaluate his claims about the kid being strong. He was hanging off of this man like a child. This is where you guys will be staying for a while, Yoi, Marco said, opening the door to what used to be the 2nd Division Commander's cabin. Whoa, Sabo ran in and checked everything out, smiling. Ace went to the bed and looked at it in amazement. So this is a bed? He said softly. Growing up with bandits, they hadn't really given him a bed, just blankets and a patch of floor to sleep on. It's really comfy. I helped Thatch find stuff for the room, Luffy said proudly, now standing beside Marco but holding his hand. Ace just eyed Luffy again, making Marco stand in front of him protectively. That didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Marco, why don't we go report to Pops that they're settling in, right? Thatchmore demanded as he grabbed his best friend by the shoulder and pulled him out of the room. Boys, if you need anything, Luffy will show you around. He smiled at them before closing the door behind him. What the hell, Yoi? Marco wasn't happy at all. Luffy needs to grow on his own. He won't gain the confidence he needs if you're hovering over him like a freaking mother hen, Thatch said, rolling his eyes. Let's trust these boys. Luffy wants this to work so bad. Why not let him give it a chance? Marco sighed in understanding, but that didn't mean he had to like it. This is a pretty big ship, so you could get lost easy, Luffy said in excitement. He hadn't stopped talking since the older men left him in the room. Ace had gotten over his fascination with the bed and tried to listen to the Hyperboy but felt a headache coming on. We should go catch our food, Sabo said, cutting Luffy off, but that only made him grin wider, which just made the two boys groan. I'll show you to the galley, the cooks here are the best. Luffy jumped around in excitement of getting food. He started to list off all of the amazing foods he had eaten on the ship to them. He was so excited to be able to talk to other children. We don't need your charity. We can catch our own food, Ace snapped, pushing Luffy down. Huh? But it's just food? You don't need to catch it, Luffy snapped back, annoyed. Who knows what could be done to the food you give us? I'll make my own. Ace and Luffy were head-to-head arguing before Sabo pushed them both apart. Thank you, for today we will eat in the galley, Sabo said, his headache growing with all of the yelling being done by the two. See, Sabo's the smarter one, Luffy said, sticking his tongue out, making Ace growl. Sabo wasn't sure when Luffy had learned his name but shrugged it off. Sabo, what the hell? Ace whispered to his friend. We need to eat, I'm hungry and this kid's close to the crew. This is a pirate crew, Ace. Who knows what they could do to us? If we get on this guy's side. He stopped and pointed his thumb towards Luffy, who was picking his nose and looking around. Then we might be safe until we can figure out a way to get back home. Ace didn't want to admit it, but that was a good plan. The kid Luffy didn't look that smart, and that could probably be used to their advantage while living on this ship. You guys ready? Luffy asked them, flicking a piece of snot off his fingers. Yeah, sure, Ace said, stuffing his hands in his pockets and walking in front of the kid, refusing to look at him. And thus Ace and Sabo met Luffy. Who knew this meeting would change their lives forever? So how long have you lived here? Sabo asked Luffy, who was giving them a tour of the ship. My whole life, I guess. I don't remember ever really leaving the ship, Luffy said, smiling, while Sabo just nodded his head in understanding. He figured that if he could get as much information out of the kid the better. You've been here your whole life and you're still that weak? Ace scoffed, glaring at Luffy. Luffy puffed his cheeks. I'm totally strong, he yelled back, making the raven head roll his eyes and smirk. Then prove it, he grinned. Fine, I'm going to show you a super amazing thing that Pop said was amazing, he said, catching their interest. Luffy sucked in a bunch of air, blowing himself up like a balloon. Pops had said it was cool, so it must be, he thought excitedly. Ace's smile faltered as an idea formed in his head that brought it back. Hey Sabo, hit him over here, Ace said, punching Luffy towards Sabo, who looked doubtful but punched him back anyways. Luffy was being passed back and forth like a ball between the two while Luffy tried to tell them to stop, all while holding in the air still. Ace hit Luffy a little too hard and he bounced overboard and into the water. Shit. He'll be fine though, right? Ace said, looking down at the water where the kid should be resurfacing. When he didn't, they started to get worried. Looking at each other, they knew they couldn't just leave him to die, so they did the next best thing. Help! Ace and Sabo screamed, causing everyone on deck to freeze up and Marco to fly down from where he was resting. What's wrong, Yoi? He said, looking around for the danger. Mr. Pineapple Head. The kid Luffy fell in the water. Sabo shouted, causing a tick to form on Marco's head in annoyance before he realized what they said. Namur. Luffy's fallen overboard, Yoi. Marco shouted, getting the fishman to nod his head and jump in the water after him. Once Namur was back on deck with the 7-year-old, Marco began to pump the water out of Luffy's mouth. What the hell, Lu? You know you can't swim, Yoi. Marco was worried and releasing it as anger. Luffy started. What happened? Thatch said, coming to check on things. Luffy fell overboard. How exactly did that happen, Yoi? Marco gave the two kids a suspicious glare that made them kick their feet a bit and not look at the man. We were playing, Sabo said, looking down. Yeah, it was an accident, Ace shouted, returning Marco the glare. Is that true, Luffy? Thatch asked the little boy, knowing he couldn't lie. Why yeah, we were just playing, Luffy replied. It wasn't a complete lie since they were playing, it just wasn't the nice playing he wanted. Why don't you come play somewhere else for a while, Luffy? Maybe I can ready you a story, Yoi. Marco said, taking Luffy's hand and trying to lead him away from the group. No, I want to play more with my new friends, he shouted towards the man who wanted Luffy somewhere he could keep an eye on him. Luffy knew that if he left his friends they would think weird things about him. Luffy, it will be fun, come play with me for a while, we'll do whatever you want, Yoi. Again he tried to lead him away from Thatch and the boys. Thatch raised his eyebrow at Marco. He knew the man was protective, but he had hoped he would give Luffy the chance to try this out. No, Marco. I just want to stay here. Luffy moved out of Marco's grasp to stand beside Ace and Sabo, who were starting to feel uncomfortable. Luffy. You can play more with them later, for now let's go do something else. Marco said, but got an angry glare from Luffy in return as tears started to form in his eyes. Why are you always stopping me from having fun with them? I hate you. Luffy screamed and ran away. Thatch, not quite sure what to do, took the boys by the shoulder and steered them away. Let's go and get something to eat. How does that sound, boys? They both nodded their heads, not quite sure what to do. Marco was frozen on spot. Luffy had said he hated him, he actually said that. Vista walked up and clapped Marco on the shoulder in sympathies. He didn't mean it. He was just angry. Vista tried to reassure the man, but Marco was lost in his own thoughts. Marco walked to the only place he could think of to collect his thoughts, Whitebeard's chair. He said he hated me, Yoi. Marco sat down in front of the older man and put his head in his hands. Whitebeard looked down at his eldest son with sad eyes. Give him time to think and clear his head, also allow your own mind to clear as well. Both of you were angry and not thinking straight. He's a child, Marco, he will say things he doesn't mean, but this is how he will learn. Pop said, making his son look at him with hope. Meanwhile, Thatch was sitting the boys down with plates of food at the table. They seem close. Ace said, playing with his food. Thatch knew he was talking about Luffy and Marco. They've been together since day one. He smiled fondly at the memory of a baby Luffy in Marco's arms. Is Marco Luffy's father? Sabo asked. He knew they didn't look alike, but the bond seemed to almost feel that way. Thatch laughed loudly. No, Marco is Luffy's brother, just as I am. Just as you both might someday be. Thatch said, smiling, leaning into his elbows on the table. What happened to his father? Ace asked, this time looking up at Thatch with dark, sad, almost angry eyes. He's out on the sea somewhere. We aren't sure where even, but we know that's where he is. Luffy doesn't even know he has a father. Marco and I have been taking care of him the most since his birth. You should have seen it. One day his father shows up and drops him off on our ship, asking us to raise him. It was truly something, I'll tell you that. Thatch smiled again. He really loved thinking about the years they've had with the brat. He doesn't know his father. What if his father's a mean man? What if the world hates him for what his father does? Ace asked. This time he had dropped his fork altogether. Sabo gave Ace a sad look. Then we will deal with that as we go. Luffy is our brother and we will protect him whether he likes it or not, Yui. Everyone looked up to see Marco enter the room. Where's Luffy? He asked Thatch, who smiled in return. His new spot, was all he said, and Marco nodded, knowing where to go. Walking to the figurehead, he saw the little boy hugging his old bear and clamped up in a small ball. Marco climbed over the railing and walked up behind Luffy, picking him up and putting him in his lap. Sorry, Yui, he said softly, taking Luffy's hat off and holding him tighter. I don't hate you, Luffy whispered softly. Marco smiled. Luffy would always be Luffy no matter what. I just worry about you. I know you're getting bigger, but some days I still see you as my little guy learning to walk and talk. I forget you need to grow up, Yui, he admitted to Luffy, who looked up at him with his big brown eyes. I also feel a bit jealous that others are getting to have the same fun with you that I always did, Yui, he also admitted with a sheepish smile. Luffy turned around in Marco's lap and gave him a hug. You'll always be special, Ma, but I want friends, he said, his voice muffled by Marco's shirt. I know, but I'm allowed to worry about you, kid, he said, returning the hug. When dinner rolled around, everything was back to as normal as it could be. Luffy sat beside the two boys who were secretly stealing food off each other's plates while Luffy watched with fascination. When dinner finished and Luffy had run after Thatch to demand some sort of sweets that were not allowed, Marco had walked up behind the two boys with a menacing aura. Boys, I'll accept you both for now, he said, trailing off the two, looking straight ahead, avoiding the man behind them. But if I ever find out you've hurt my little brother in any way." He left the sentence at that and walked away with an evil smirk. Lesson for them to learn: never piss off an overprotective flaming turkey. "I can't wait," Luffy said excitedly. He wanted to go back to the New World so badly he was shaking. "Well, we have a few more islands to stop at before we reach Fishman Island, Yoi," Marco said with a smile. Luffy loved the chaos that filled the New World. He had been raised in it, so he really didn't know anything else. "We're going further into the Grand Line?" Sabo asked Luffy. He was sitting on the railing listening to them talk. I've only been in Parapes a few times before," Luffy said, then was corrected by Marco. "You mean Paradise, Yoi?" Marco laughed at Luffy's ability to say simple things wrong. Luffy nodded his head, saying that was exactly what he meant. "Paradise?" Ace asked, coming into the conversation. "Everyone calls the first half of the Grand Line Paradise in the New World," Thatch clarified to Ace, who nodded his head in understanding. Well, as understanding as could be for a child. "Why don't we just go straight there instead of lingering here then?" Sabo asked in confusion. If Luffy was able to handle it, surely him and Ace could take it. After all, they were a lot stronger than him. "Because you guys don't seem to be used to living out here yet, Yoi," Marco said, giving the pair a look. "What do you mean by that?" Ace shouted, stomping his foot. He felt that Marco had indirectly called him weaker than Luffy. "The Grand Line's weather is harsh and changes frequently. The New World is harsher and kinda scary at times." "You boys are from the East Blue, right?" Thatch asked them with a smile. The boys nodded their heads, slightly shocked. Thatch knew where they were from. "The East Blue is known as the weakest of the blues. You boys will need a bit of time to adjust." And with that he waved to them and headed towards the kitchen. Ace and Sabo looked at each other in worry. Sure, they were excited to see the New World, but really, they just wanted to go back to Dawn Island and get their pirate fund. "Why are you so excited to go back to the New World?" Sabo asked Luffy, who was now sparkling in excitement. "Because we go to Fishman Island," he shouted, throwing his hand up. "Fishman?" Ace started. "Island?" Sabo finished in confusion. They have the most amazing sweets ever." Drool started to pour out of the kid's mouth and sparkles formed in his eyes. Marco sighed, knowing that was what he wanted. Ever since he had cut Luffy off of the headache-inducing, sugary things, he had demanded Fishman Islands whenever they got close. Since they only visited the island every once in a while, he couldn't refuse the sad eyes Luffy directed towards him. "Rigot," Sabo said, not really sure what else to say to the kid. "We'll be coming to a summer island in about an hour, so go entertain yourselves until then, Yoi," Marco said, waving his hand in dismissal. Luffy ran and gave him a big hug with a whispered thanks before he ran after the two boys who had started to walk away, making Marco smile. "He's getting so big so fast," Haruta said with a smile. "He is, isn't he, Yoi?" Marco watched the kid fondly chase after the boys, who looked annoyed by him being there. Ace whispered something to Sabo and Luffy started to jump around excitedly. "He's making friends, it's a good thing. I was getting worried," Namor said, joining in with the group. Luffy said something to the two boys, who seemed to panic, making them grab him and pull him into their room. Marco raised his eyebrows. He thought his threat to them would be enough. "They're up to something, Yoi." Marco went to take a step forward but was smacked in the chest by Izu's fan. "Don't interfere. You remember what Luffy said the last time your brother complex went off?" The cross-dresser gave Marco a knowing look as he flinched at the memory of being told he was hated. "But what if?" he started, but got a glare in return. "Watch him from a distance, Marco. He needs space now. He's not the baby he used to be." Pouting slightly, Marco waved them off and headed to his room to distract himself with paperwork. "You guys have a treasure." Luffy was practically bouncing. Ace and Sabo looked at one another, not quite sure what to do. They took him into their room in hopes to distract him. "You're too loud," Sabo shouted at him when they got in the room. "What if those pirates heard you?" Ace shouted as well, making Luffy tilt his head in confusion. "So, no one would take it?" he said softly. "You don't know that, after all the work we've done, they might want it?" Luffy was growing more and more confused as they kept going on about the reasons why his siblings would take their treasure. They only stopped talking when a knock was heard at the door. "Boys, everything all right in there?" A voice called. Sabo, getting worried that they themselves had been too loud, called back innocently. "Yeah, we're just playing," he said. The person on the other side seemed to buy that and replied with, Alright, we just reached the new island, so come get yourselves ready to explore it soon. And with that the person left them alone. New island? Luffy sped past them and out the door, completely ignoring them as if he didn't even care what they had been talking about. Ace and Sabo hung back in the room though. There might be people we can rob from here on these islands, Sabo said excitedly. We need to restart our pirate fund. Even if we did make it home, there's always a chance it's already been stolen. If it hasn't been though, we can still add what we've now got later to it. Ace smiled and fist bumped his friend, who returned the gesture. Racing after Luffy, they saw him holding Marco's hand and talking excitedly about random things they couldn't follow. Boys, why don't you and Luffy explore the village a bit? Thatch said, knowing this village well. He knew there was a large town close by but figured Luffy would just want to show them around the small one. Luffy didn't like too big of crowds, usually he just chose to stay with his brothers, so being asked to go with his new friends he was a little excited but also a little scared. What? Afraid of being without your pirate friends? Ace scoffed in annoyance of being tied to the kid. No, let's go. Bye Pops. He called and waved at his family. Marco was giving Thatch a death glare. What? Don't look at me like that. This is a small village, what trouble could they get into? Marco just glared more and walked off the ship towards the village to start his duties of restocking and preparing. Luffy was given a small pouch of money from Thatch to buy snacks as he followed the pair towards the village as well. Sabo had been listening to the crew since they mentioned a new island and heard about a small town away from this one. We can go to the town next to here and take action, he whispered to Ace. Yeah, but first we need to ditch the kid, he whispered back, pointing at Luffy with his thumb. Sabo replied and thought of ways to ditch him, then an idea came to life. Luffy? I'm starving, want to grab some lunch? He asked the kid, whose eyes grew in excitement. MNN, he replied, and the three went to a small restaurant to sit down. Ace had no clue what was going through his friend's mind. Once food was ordered and Sabo ate enough to distract the kid, he started to look for an escape. I'm full. Luffy, do you want the rest? Sabo pushed his much unfinished plate towards him, making the kid smile wider. Of course, he started to dig in. That's when Sabo took his action. Luffy, your brothers are all in this village, so we're going to go look around on our own a little bit, he said quickly and grabbed Ace's arm, pulling him up. Don't go anywhere, K. He smiled forcefully towards the boy, who was just eating as much food as he could. Taking that as an understanding, the pair left the restaurant in a hurry. Luffy had the money, so they didn't worry too much about the bill. I think I saw a map back here that will point us to the next town over, Sabo said, thinking fast in hopes the kid didn't finish anytime soon. Finding the map and feeling relief that the town wasn't that far away, the boys took off towards LLY. Looking up, realized that his friends were gone. Paying quickly for the meals, he raced from the restaurant towards the boys. He saw them heading towards a path and decided to follow them and see what happens. Marco had told him that sometimes being sneaky was okay if it kept him safe. He knew his friends wouldn't hurt him, but he wanted to try it out this one time. He followed behind them for a while until they reached a small town, but it was larger than the last one. He kept his distance from others and watched them move through the crowds. They were stuffing their hands in pockets as they walked by so easily and putting what they grabbed into their own pockets. Luffy was so fascinated by them and the way they moved. It was like they had been doing this for years. When the boys figured they had enough, they ran towards a forest area to count their loot with a huge smile on both their faces. Wow, we actually did quite well. I wasn't sure what we'd get here being away from home, Sabo said, counting the amount of bellies in his hand. Ace grinned, counting his own amount, nodding in agreement. Wow, you guys were amazing, Luffy said excitedly from forest floor, making the two boys freeze. Luffy had followed them so silently. Racing down the tree, they grabbed him and tied him up. Ace provided the rope from his pants pocket. What are we going to do? He'll tell everyone, Sabo asked in worry. We'll have to kill him, Ace said quietly, and Sabo looked at Luffy with a serious face, nodding in agreement. What? Don't kill me. Don't throw me in the water. Help me somebody, Luffy shouted at the top of his lungs. Both boys looked at each other in confusion. Why did he tell us that? Sabo asked in confusion, and Ace just closed his eyes in irritation. Because he's an idiot, you kill him already, Ace said, looking up at Sabo, who had his mouth fall open in surprise. What? You kill him? I've never killed anyone before, He screamed back at Ace, who replied that had never before either. The entire time Luffy was still screaming and crying about being killed by his friends. "Hey, I think I found something." A man's voice called out. Ace and Sabo looked at each other before letting Luffy go, hoping he would go and hide. "Where did those brats go?" "Stealing from pirates," a tall man said, stomping through the forest. "Shit, we stole from a pirate," Ace said, calling himself every amount of stupid he could think of. "Hey, where did Luffy go?" Sabo asked, looking around. "Ah." They both turned in time to see Luffy being held up by the man. "And who are you?" he asked Luffy, who glared at him. "No one, you stupid gorilla." The man didn't like being called that, and a tick appeared on his head. "Boss, that kid was following behind those brats that robbed us," a smaller guy said, pointing at Luffy. "Oh, do you know where I could find your friends, child?" he said in what appeared to be a friendly voice, but his tone gave away his intentions. "No, I have no idea," Luffy said, his face starting to sweat and his lips forming a pout while he refused to look the man in the eyes. "Such a bad liar," he said in surprise. "Well, why don't we go and see if we can jog your memory?" "Nay," the man said with a smile, carrying Luffy off into the forest.